This is the story of a 30-year overnight success. From a childhood in the markets of Taiwan to the harsh discipline of a Kentucky reform school, and finally to the pinnacle of Silicon Valley, this is the architect of the future. He didn't just build a company, he built the engine of human intelligence. The Parallel Architect, Jensen Huang and the Silicon Engine of Intelligence. Written by Jamie Glick. Narrated by Christopher. In this comprehensive biography, we trace the relentless 63-year journey of the longest-serving CEO in Silicon Valley. We go inside the legendary diving catches that saved NVIDIA from the brink of bankruptcy, and examine the radical architectural pivots that transformed a niche graphics card maker into a trillion-dollar powerhouse. From the Denny's Covenant to the invention of the GPU, from the multi-billion-dollar gamble on CUDA to the birth of the Blackwell superchips. This is the definitive account of how Jensen Huang built the machines that are teaching the world to think. Chapter 1: The Taiwan Genesis. 1963 to 1972. Close your eyes for a moment, and let the world slow down. Imagine the air of southern Taiwan, thick and warm, carrying the faint salt of the Taiwan Strait, the distant call of vendors in an open market, the low hum of a city that has known centuries of reinvention. This is Tainan, one of the oldest cities on the island. A place where the past and the future have always existed in an uneasy, generative tension. A city of temples and trade routes, of Confucian academies and colonial histories, of people who have learned, across generations, that survival belongs to those who adapt. It is here, on the 17th of February, 1963, that a boy is born into a family that carries within it the two great pillars of human civilization: science and education. His name is Jensen Huang. He does not know it yet. How could he? He is newborn, held in the arms of a mother who has already decided, in the quiet conviction that only certain kinds of parents possess, that her children will be exceptional. Not merely successful. Exceptional. There is a difference, and she understands it intuitively. His father, Huang Xingtai, is a chemical engineer. Pause on that for a moment. Not just a man who works with chemicals, but a man who thinks in systems, who understands that the world, at its most fundamental level, is a question of structure, of how elements combine, of how invisible forces shape visible outcomes. He moves through his professional life with the particular confidence of someone who has learned to see beneath the surface of things, to understand not just what something is, but why it behaves the way it does. His mother, Lo Tsai-su, is a grade school teacher. And if the father is the man of systems, she is the woman of transmission, of taking what is known and making it knowable. She understands that knowledge is not merely possessed. It is passed. It is translated. It is broken down into its smallest components and then rebuilt inside another mind, carefully, patiently, with attention to what is understood and what remains opaque. Together they form a household that is, in its own quiet way, a kind of prototype. A proof of concept. The engineer father and the teacher mother, one who solves the problem, one who explains the solution. One who builds the machine, one who makes the machine comprehensible. Jensen is born into this. He breathes it. He will not recognize its shape for many years, but it is already forming him. In the early 1960s, Tainan is a city in transition. Taiwan itself is in transition. The island, separated from mainland China since 1949, is building itself from the ground up under the government of the Republic of China. A nation in miniature, determined to demonstrate that it can be something, even in the shadow of a much larger neighbor that refuses to acknowledge its existence. There is an energy here, almost invisible but pervasive. The energy of people who know they cannot take stability for granted, who understand that the ground beneath their feet has shifted before and may shift again. For Jensen's father, professional ambition and geopolitical reality are not separate forces. They are deeply intertwined. He is a man with skills and demand, in the middle of the 20th century's long technological expansion, tends to move. It moves toward opportunity. It moves toward stability. And so, when Jensen is approximately 5 years old, the Huang family moves. They go to Thailand. Picture the boy Jensen on the day of that departure. too young to carry the weight of what he is leaving, old enough to register the strangeness of change. Tainan, with its familiar streets and its particular quality of afternoon light, recedes. Ahead lies Bangkok, or one of Thailand's sprawling, complicated cities. A different language, a different climate, a different set of rhythms. For a child, every move is a kind of small dissolution. The world you knew becomes the world you knew. Past tense. But the Huang household does not dissolve. It reconstitutes. It adapts. This, too, is something Jensen will carry with him, not as a lesson learned but as an experience lived. Home is not a fixed coordinate. Home is wherever the family holds. His father settles into work. The family settles into routine. But the world outside does not cooperate. To the north and east, the Vietnam War is doing what wars do, spilling, spreading, destabilizing the region in ways that no single family can predict or control. Southeast Asia in the late 1960s is a geography of anxiety, and Thailand, despite its official non-alignment, is not immune to the pressures pressing in from all sides. American military presence, refugee flows, political tensions that simmer at levels that only those paying close attention can fully measure. Huang Xingtai is paying attention. He is an engineer, which means he runs calculations not just on chemical compounds but on risk, on probability, on which path leads toward stability and which leads toward uncertainty. The calculation resolves clearly. His children need a future that this region in this moment cannot guarantee. They need to go somewhere that the war cannot reach. Somewhere that the institutions hold. Somewhere that the opportunity is structural and not merely circumstantial. They need to go to America. But America is not simply a destination you arrive at. It is a destination you must earn. You must qualify for it. You must prepare your children for it. And preparation, in Lo Tsai-Su's understanding, begins with language. English. She begins the ritual. Every day, not most days, not when there is time, but every single day, she opens the English dictionary. The ritual is precise and demanding and, to a child, probably formidable. 10 words. Random words. Not a curated list of easy vocabulary, not a gentle progression from simple to complex, but 10 words selected almost arbitrarily, as the world tends to select its challenges. You must know the spelling. You must know the pronunciation. You must know the meaning. You must know all three before the day ends. Imagine Jensen at the kitchen table, his mother across from him, the dictionary open between them like a portal to another world. The words are strange. Some of them are long. Some of them describe concepts that have no immediate translation into the sensory world of a young boy. But his mother is patient and firm in the way that only the best teachers can be, patient not because she expects slowness but because she respects the process. Firm not because she is unkind, but because she understands that the kindest thing she can do is refuse to lower the standard. 10 words a day. Spelling. Pronunciation. Meaning. At first, it is just memorization. The words sit on the surface of the mind, slippery and foreign. But over days and weeks and months something else begins to happen. The architecture changes. The mind learns not just the words but the habit of rapid acquisition, the habit of holding multiple channels of information simultaneously, the habit of not being overwhelmed by what you do not yet know because you have learned that not knowing is simply the condition that precedes knowing. This is, in a very deep sense, Jensen Huang's first education in parallel processing. Not silicon. Not CUDA. Not GPU compute. But the original version of the idea. Hold many things at once. Process them simultaneously. Move through the complexity without being paralyzed by it. And do it every day, not just when the task is convenient. His mother is teaching him English. She is also, without either of them knowing it yet, teaching him how to think. The brother is there too, learning alongside Jensen, the two of them bound together in this daily exercise the way that children who share a household and a challenge become a kind of small team. There is competition, perhaps. There is the solidarity of shared difficulty. There is the particular bond that forms when two people are held to the same high standard by someone they love and trust. Years later, Jensen Huang will speak of his parents with a reverence that is striking in someone who has otherwise learned to be precise and unsentimental about most things. The reverence is for this. For the 10 words. for the refusal to prepare him for a lesser version of the world than the one that was actually waiting. But the chapter that is opening in Taiwan and continuing in Thailand has not yet reached its climax. The family is not yet in America. The immigration paperwork, the logistics, the timeline, all of this is still ahead. What exists now, in this humid equatorial present, is preparation, practice. The slow accumulation of capacity that will one day be called genius, but which is, in this moment, simply discipline. Jensen is young. He runs and plays the way young boys run and play. He does not yet understand that the world his parents are preparing him for will be larger, stranger, and more demanding than anything a child can imagine from the vantage point of a family kitchen. He does not yet know about semiconductors or graphics cards, or the way that light can be bent by mathematics into something that looks like rain falling in a video game at 60 frames per second. He does not know about NVIDIA. How could he? He knows words. He knows that his mother will ask him again tomorrow for 10 more. He knows that his father looks at problems until they yield. He knows that the family is going somewhere, and that somewhere requires preparation. He is being built. Carefully, deliberately, with love as the animating principle. Taiwan is behind him now. Thailand is his present. America is somewhere ahead, a concept, not yet a place. But the architecture of the man is already forming in the boy. The parallel processing. The high bandwidth communication. The refusal to accept the gap between what is known and what is needed as a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. The world in 1963 is not yet digital. The world in 1968 is not yet digital. The revolution that Jensen Huang will one day help to drive is still decades away, incubating in university labs and Defense Department contracts and the restless imaginations of engineers who sense, without being able to fully articulate it, that something enormous is coming. But in a house in Southeast Asia, a woman opens a dictionary. A boy sits down. The words begin. And the story that will eventually reshape the entire architecture of artificial intelligence takes its first quiet syllable-by-syllable steps. Chapter 2. The Crucible of Oneida. 1972 to 1981. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to children. It is not the loneliness of the philosopher, which carries with it the consolation of self-awareness. It is not the loneliness of the exile, which at least arrives with memory intact and identity already formed. It is the loneliness of the child who is placed, by forces entirely beyond their control, into a world that does not know them and does not particularly wish to, a world that is strange in its sounds and its customs and its cruelties, and which offers no map and no guide and no explanation for why any of this is happening. In 1972, Jensen Huang is 9 years old. He and his brother are leaving Southeast Asia. Not to join their parents in the promised destination of America. Not yet. Their parents must remain in Thailand a while longer, attending to the long and bureaucratic business of finalizing their own immigration paperwork. The boys cannot wait. The decision is made, as many decisions in immigrant families are made, with the best available information and a faith that things will resolve. They are sent ahead to an uncle in Tacoma, Washington. The Pacific Northwest. America. Imagine that crossing. Imagine the boy Jensen, 9 years old, carrying whatever a 9-year-old carries when he is moving between worlds, landing in Tacoma. The air here is different. Cooler. The light is different. The Pacific Northwest has a particular quality of gray and green that is unlike anything in Taiwan or Thailand, a landscape that is lush but restrained, beautiful in a way that does not immediately announce itself. It is not unwelcoming. But it is not familiar. The uncle receives them. He is well-intentioned. This is important to establish because the story that follows is not a story of malice. It is a story of a mistake. A well-intentioned, consequential, life-altering mistake. The uncle wants the boys educated. He wants them in a structured environment. He has heard of a school, a boarding institution in rural Kentucky, the Oneida Baptist Institute, and what he has heard suggests quality, structure, discipline. An elite environment that will prepare these boys for the demanding American future their parents have sacrificed so much to give them. He is wrong. The Oneida Baptist Institute is not what he believes it to be. It is not a prestigious academy. It is, in the vocabulary of the era, a reform school, an institution designed not for the children of ambition but for children who have been deemed difficult, troubled, in need of correction rather than cultivation. The students who fill its dormitories are not there by choice. They are there because the ordinary structures of family and community have, for one reason or another, failed to contain them. Oneida is where you send a problem. It is not where you send a promise. But the uncle does not know this. And so the boys are enrolled. And Jensen Huang, age 9, who has spent the last several years at a kitchen table in Southeast Asia learning 10 English words a day at his mother's insistence, who has been formed in a household of engineering precision and pedagogical care, who carries within him the patient, high-standard love of two parents who have given everything to the project of his future. Jensen Huang arrives at Oneida Baptist Institute in rural Kentucky. Let us be honest about what this place is. It is a departure from everything he has known. Not merely a change of scenery but a fundamental rupture in the logic of his world. The household in Tainan operated on a principle. Effort leads to understanding, understanding leads to capability, capability leads to opportunity. That was the promise embedded in every vocabulary lesson. Every evening his father spent bent over a technical problem. Every conversation that assumed the future was something you built deliberately. Oneida does not operate on that principle. At Oneida, Jensen is assigned labor. Specifically, and in a detail that has stayed with him for decades, that he has returned to in interviews and conversations throughout his career, not with bitterness but with a kind of unflinching acknowledgement. He is assigned the task of cleaning the school's toilets. Every day. This is his role. His brother is sent to work on a local tobacco farm, the physical labor of the American South in the early 1970s, the kind of work that puts calluses on a boy's hands and a particular knowledge of exhaustion into his muscles. The social environment is worse. The other students at Oneida are not welcoming. They are not curious about the two Asian boys who have arrived among them. The America that Jensen encounters at Oneida is not the America of his parents' aspirations, not the country of expanding possibility and meritocratic reward. It is a narrower, harder place. A place where difference is not interesting but threatening. Where a boy who looks different, who speaks with an accent, who carries himself with the quiet dignity of someone whose parents have told him he is exceptional, becomes a target. He is called names. Ethnic slurs. The particular vocabulary of contempt that America has always kept in reserve for those who arrive from elsewhere. He is physically intimidated. He has recalled in the decades since being threatened with knives. Not hypothetically. Not in the abstract. Knives in the hands of other boys, pointed in his direction as a communication. A message about where he stands in the hierarchy of this place, which is to say, at the bottom, among the unprotected, among those whom the institution's thin structures of authority do not bother to shield. He is 9, 10, 11 years old. Sit with that for a moment. Not to wallow in it, Jensen Huang himself has never wallowed in it, but to understand the full weight of what is being asked of this child. He has crossed an ocean. He has been separated from his parents. He has been placed, through no fault of his own and through his uncle's honest but catastrophic miscalculation, in an environment that is hostile to his very existence. He cleans toilets. He is threatened. He is far from anyone who loves him. And he does not break. This is the astonishing fact at the center of this chapter. Not the hardship. Hardship is common enough in the world, and the world is full of people who have suffered more than Jensen Huang suffered at Oneida. What is remarkable is the response. What is remarkable is what happens inside a child when the world offers him nothing but pressure, and he discovers, not through instruction but through lived necessity, that pressure is something he can absorb. There is a phrase that Jensen Huang has used in the years since, when he speaks about this period of his life, that hardship is often the price of greatness. He does not say this the way someone says it who has read it in a motivational book. He says it the way someone says it who learned it the hard way, in a dormitory in rural Kentucky, with a mop in his hand and the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same as today unless he found a way to make the inside of himself more stable than the outside world. What he is building, without knowing the technical vocabulary for it, is resilience. Not the performance of resilience, not the public face of someone who pretends not to be hurt. Real resilience. The internal architecture that allows a person to experience difficulty without being defined by it. The ability to hold a long view when the immediate view is bleak. The capacity to separate identity from circumstance, to know, even in a moment of humiliation, that the humiliation is something happening to you, not something that is you. At Oneida, Jensen Huang learned something that no classroom could have taught him, that fear is a choice. Not always. There are real dangers in the world, and courage is not the absence of recognizing them. But the fear that paralyzes, the fear that makes a person smaller than they are, the fear that causes someone to surrender the core of themselves in exchange for a moment of relief, that kind of fear, he learns, is something that can be declined. Something that can be met with the quiet internal resistance of a person who has decided that what matters most cannot be taken by intimidation. He has called this his no-fear attitude. It is a phrase that sounds simple, almost casual. It is neither. This is the psychological fortitude that will, decades later, allow him to steer a company called NVIDIA through a series of crises that should have been fatal. Through moments when the chip designs failed, when the money was running out, when the partnerships dissolved, when the entire enterprise seemed to be collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. Jensen Huang will sit in those rooms and will not panic. Not because he does not understand the stakes. Precisely because he understands the stakes and has already learned, in a dormitory in Kentucky at the age of 10, that understanding the stakes and being destroyed by them are not the same thing. The boys survive Oneida. They endure it. And eventually, their parents arrive in America. Their mother and father, having finally navigated the long bureaucratic passage of immigration, come to the United States and discover, with a horror that can only be imagined, what has been done to their sons. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but consequentially. The school is not what they were told it was. Their boys have been cleaning toilets and working tobacco farms and sleeping in an institution designed for troubled children while they, the parents who gave everything to give their sons a better life, finalized their paperwork half a world away. They remove the boys immediately. The family settles. Beaverton, Oregon. A suburb of Portland in the Pacific Northwest, which in the 1970s is a place of quiet modernity, neither the glamour of California nor the edginess of the East Coast, but something more measured, more livable. The kind of place where a family that has been through a great deal can begin to exhale. Jensen enrolls at Aloha High School. And something shifts. The pressure that Oneida applied, relentless, arbitrary, designed for no purpose except institutional control, is gone. What remains is what Oneida, perhaps inadvertently, forged. A boy who has been tested in ways that most of his new Oregon classmates cannot imagine. A boy who has cleaned toilets and survived threats and held himself together without the support of parents or the comfort of belonging. A boy who, because the world gave him no one else to rely on, has learned to rely absolutely and completely on himself. This boy needs a new outlet. He finds it on a table, across a small white net, with a lightweight paddle in his hand. Table tennis. It seems almost comically modest against the backdrop of what has come before. But there is nothing modest about the way Jensen Huang plays table tennis. He plays it the way he will later run a company, with total focus, with the willingness to outwork everyone in the room, with the particular intensity of someone who has decided that winning is a form of discipline, not just an outcome. The sport rewards exactly what Oneida, strange as it sounds, helped develop. Table tennis is a game of rapid information processing. The ball comes at you fast, the angles are tight, the margins are small, and the player who wins is almost never the player with the most physical gifts. It is the player with the fastest processing speed. The player who reads the situation before it fully develops. The player who is not afraid of the next shot because they are already calculating where the shot after that will go. Huang rises. He trains. He reaches a national ranking, not a good for a high schooler ranking but an actual national ranking, placing him among the best young players in the country. This is not an accident. It is the expression of a mind that has been pressure tested, that has been forced to find its own stability, that has learned in the most difficult possible circumstances that performance under pressure is not a gift you are given but a skill you build. At Aloha High School, Jensen Huang is becoming The peculiar, painful, formative arc that began in Tainan and bent through Thailand and reached its most severe angle in the hills of rural Kentucky is beginning, slowly, to curve toward something. He does not know yet what it will be. He is a teenager in Beaverton, Oregon, playing table tennis, attending classes, beginning to discover the world of electronics and mathematics that will eventually consume his professional life entirely. The GPU is not yet a concept. NVIDIA is not yet a company. The future is not yet visible. But the man is being made. In the repetition of the training hall, the serve, the return, the rally, the point, the same principle his mother installed at the kitchen table in Southeast Asia is being reinforced. Discipline, applied consistently over time in the face of resistance, produces capability that nothing else can produce. Jensen Huang has paid a price that no child should have to pay. And from it, he has taken something that very few people in the world possess. The crucible of Oneida is behind him. The education it provided, brutal, unintended, indelible, is now inside him, inseparable from everything he will become. The world has no idea what is coming. Chapter 3. Silicon Valley Apprenticeship, 1981 to 1993. There is a moment in the life of every exceptional person when the raw material of who they are meets, for the first time, the structured world of what they might become. For Jensen Huang, that moment arrives in 1981, in the quiet town of Corvallis, Oregon, on the campus of Oregon State University. He is 18 years old. Behind him, Tainan, Bangkok, Oneida, Beaverton. Behind him, a mother's dictionary and a father's precision and a reform school's cruelty and a table tennis paddle worn smooth from 10,000 practice hours. Behind him, a childhood that did not ask permission before it taught its lessons, that did not soften its edges for the sake of a boy's comfort, that deposited into Jensen Huang a set of internal resources so durable and so deep that he will spend the rest of his life drawing on them without ever quite reaching the bottom. Ahead of him, electrical engineering. He chooses Oregon State largely because of cost. This is worth acknowledging plainly, because the mythology of great careers tends to retroactively assign grand intention to every decision, as though the exceptional person always knew at every turn exactly where they were going. Jensen Huang did not choose Oregon State because he had a vision. He chose it because his family had limited resources and Oregon State was affordable and offered a rigorous engineering program. This is the kind of pragmatic, unsentimental decision-making that will later become one of his defining professional characteristics. The ability to work brilliantly within constraints rather than being paralyzed by the absence of ideal conditions. The Corvallis campus in the early 1980s is a particular kind of American place. Green and orderly, set in the Willamette Valley between the Coast Range and the Cascades, it has the quality of a world apart, a place designed for the business of thinking, buffered from the noise of larger cities by geography and intention. The engineering buildings are not glamorous. The labs are functional, practical, oriented toward the specific and demanding work of understanding how electrons behave when you ask them to do things on your behalf. Jensen Huang takes to it immediately. The rigorous foundation of electrical engineering, circuit theory, semiconductor physics, signal processing, the mathematics of systems that must perform reliably under real-world conditions, is not, for him, an imposition. It is a homecoming of a kind. He grew up in a household where the structure of the physical world was understood to be knowable, navigable, subject to human intelligence and human effort. His father spent his professional life applying the principles of chemistry to practical problems. His mother spent hers breaking complex knowledge into transmissible form. Oregon State's electrical engineering program is, in its deepest sense, a continuation of what his parents began. He is good at this. Not merely competent, genuinely, impressively good. The kind of student who grasps not just the techniques but the underlying logic, who understands why the equations behave as they do rather than simply memorizing how to manipulate them. There is a difference between a student who learns the rules and a student who understands the game, and Jensen Huang, from the beginning of his time at Oregon State, is clearly the latter. But the most consequential thing that happens to Jensen Huang at Oregon State University is not a course or a laboratory or a breakthrough in his understanding of semiconductor physics. It is a conversation. He is a student in one of his engineering classes. So is she, Lori Mills, also studying engineering, also possessed of the particular combination of intelligence and seriousness that the program demands. The story of how Jensen Huang approaches Lori Mills has become, over the years, one of those small biographical details that reveals character in the way that grand gestures rarely can. He asks her, with what he himself has since described as his best pickup line, whether she would like to see his homework. Let that settle for a moment. Not a rehearsed compliment. Not a performance of charm. A homework offer, delivered with the earnest, slightly awkward directness of a young engineer who has learned, perhaps at Oneida, that the performance of things is less useful than the reality of things. He has good homework. He is interested in her. He combines these facts into an invitation. It is not smooth. It is, in its own way, perfect. Lori says yes. This is a partnership that will endure everything. The failures and the near failures, the all-night design sessions and the quarterly earnings calls, the decades of building something from nothing in an industry that is merciless with those who get the calculations wrong. But that is ahead. For now, they are two engineering students in Corvallis, Oregon, doing homework together, and the future is still theoretical. Jensen graduates with honors in 1984. The honors matter. Not because they are a credential. In Silicon Valley, credentials are necessary but never sufficient, but because they are evidence of the completeness of his engagement. He has not merely passed through Oregon State. He has used it. He has extracted from it everything it has to offer and synthesized it into a foundation that is, by any measure, exceptional. He is 21 years old. And the semiconductor industry is waiting. The industry he enters in 1984 is not the industry of today. It is louder, more chaotic, more openly experimental, more willing to tolerate grand failure in the service of grand ambition. Silicon Valley in the early 1980s is a place in the process of discovering what it is, a geography of garages and startups and venture capital and the particular electricity of people who have looked at the world's existing structures and decided, with varying degrees of justification, that they can do better. The microprocessor revolution is not yet a decade old. The personal computer has arrived but is still finding its form. The internet does not yet exist in any recognizable sense. What exists is the chip, the semiconductor, the integrated circuit, the miniaturized landscape of transistors and pathways that transforms mathematical operations into physical reality at speeds the human mind cannot directly perceive. This is the medium in which Jensen Huang will spend his life, and he enters it in 1984 through a door marked Advanced Micro Devices. MD. It is already a significant company when Jensen Huang arrives, a genuine competitor to Intel, operating in the fast-moving, margin-sensitive world of microprocessor design and manufacturing. He is hired as a microchip designer, which means he enters the industry at its most fundamental level, not managing the business of chips but designing the chips themselves. The actual architecture. The layout of transistors on silicon. The translation of computational requirements into physical structures small enough to fit on a surface you could cover with your thumbnail. This is exacting work. It is work that demands a kind of thinking that is simultaneously abstract and precise. The ability to reason about systems that are both conceptually complex and physically real, to hold in mind the mathematical logic of a design while attending to the material constraints of its implementation. Jensen Huang is good at this. But he is already noticing something. The CPU, the central processing unit that is the heart of every personal computer in 1984, is a magnificent piece of engineering. It is fast, flexible, general purpose, capable of handling an extraordinary range of computational tasks with elegance and efficiency. But it is, at its core, a serial processor. It takes one task, completes it, takes the next task, completes that. It does this extraordinarily quickly, but it does it in sequence. And Jensen Huang is beginning to understand, not yet fully, not yet as a formed thesis, but as an intuition gathering at the edges of his professional awareness, that there are certain kinds of problems for which serial processing is not merely inefficient but fundamentally inadequate. Problems that are not sequences of tasks but fields of simultaneous operations. Problems that require not the rapid completion of one thing after another but the simultaneous computation of thousands of things at once. He cannot yet name what he is looking for. But he is already looking. He does not stay at AMD long. He learns what AMD has to teach him, the ground-level reality of CPU architecture, the physics of silicon at scale, the competitive dynamics of the semiconductor market, the way that design decisions made at the transistor level propagate upward into the performance characteristics that engineers and consumers will eventually experience. This is education of the most practical kind, and he absorbs it with the completeness that has characterized his learning since his mother first opened the dictionary. Then he moves. LSI Logic Corporation is a different kind of company. Where AMD is a high-volume manufacturer of general-purpose processors, LSI Logic occupies a more specialized corner of the semiconductor landscape, the world of application-specific integrated circuits, or ASICs. These are chips designed not for general use but for specific applications, custom-built to perform a particular set of functions with maximum efficiency. If the CPU is a Swiss Army knife, the ASIC is a scalpel. At LSI Logic, Jensen Huang begins a rapid and remarkable ascent. He arrives as a design engineer, but he does not remain one. The same quality that allowed him to survive Oneida, the ability to hold himself together under pressure, to think clearly when the environment is demanding, to maintain the long view when the immediate view is complicated, begins to express itself in a professional context. His colleagues and managers notice that he understands not just the technical problems in front of him but the context in which those problems exist. He understands why certain design choices matter beyond the circuit board. He understands how technical decisions connect to business outcomes. He understands, in short, that engineering is not practiced in a vacuum. He moves into management. This transition, from engineer to manager, is one of the most consequential passages in Jensen Huang's formation, because it is at LSI Logic that he acquires something genuinely rare in the semiconductor industry. What might be called a dual fluency. The ability to speak with authority in the technical language of chip design and simultaneously in the strategic language of business. Most companies in the industry and most industries adjacent to it are structured around the assumption that these two languages belong to different people. The engineers design. The business people sell. The executives set strategy. The genius of the technical founder is real, but it is often limited by the inability to translate that genius into financial sustainability. Jensen Huang is becoming someone who can do both. Who can sit with a team of engineers and engage with the deepest details of a design problem, and then stand up and walk into a room full of investors or customers and articulate, with clarity and conviction, why that design problem matters and what its solution is worth. He rises to become the director of a company division. He is in his late 20s. He is managing people and budgets and timelines and all the complex, unpredictable human machinery of a functioning business unit. He is learning, in the most practical possible setting, what it means to be responsible for outcomes rather than merely for effort. And he is going back to school. While working full-time at LSI Logic, Jensen Huang enrolls in the graduate electrical engineering program at Stanford University. This decision, to pursue a master's degree while managing a corporate division, while building a marriage, while navigating the demands of a career in one of the most competitive industries in the world, is not an act of self-punishment. It is an act of deliberate expansion. He has identified a gap between what he knows and what he needs to know, and he is closing it. Stanford in the late 1980s and early 1990s is not yet the mythological institution it will become in the collective imagination of Silicon Valley. It is already, of course, exceptional, rigorous and well-resourced and deeply connected to the industry that has grown up around it. But the particular legend of Stanford as the nursery of the tech industry is still being written, and Jensen Huang is, in a modest but real sense, one of the people writing it. He completes his master's degree in electrical engineering in 1992. By this point, the world is changing in ways that those paying close attention can feel more than they can see. The multimedia PC is emerging. The personal computer is no longer merely a text-based machine for spreadsheets and word processing but is beginning to incorporate images, sound, video, the first rough gestures toward a rich digital experience that will eventually become the visual world we now take entirely for granted. Games are becoming graphically ambitious. Simulations are demanding more from hardware than hardware was designed to provide. The rendering of complex images in real time, the translation of mathematical descriptions of three-dimensional space into the pixels that appear on a monitor, is pushing the limits of what the CPU was ever built to do. Jensen Huang has been thinking about this for years. The intuition that began at AMD, the sense that serial processing has a ceiling, that certain problems require a fundamentally different kind of computational architecture, has matured into something much more specific. He can now name what he has been looking for. He can describe, in technical and business terms, the gap in the market that exists between what current hardware can do and what the emerging visual computing world is going to demand. He is 30 years old. He has an undergraduate degree from Oregon State, a master's from Stanford, a decade of experience across 2 major semiconductor companies, a management track record, and a marriage to a woman who has been with him long enough to understand exactly what he is capable of and what he is planning. The apprenticeship is complete. In the long architecture of Jensen Huang's life, this decade, from the first engineering lecture at Oregon State to the final examination at Stanford, functions as the necessary foundation. Not the dramatic part. Not the part that will be in the headlines. But the part without which nothing else is possible. The technical mastery, the business fluency, the management experience, the recognition of a market gap that no one else is yet positioned to fill, all of it converges in 1993 toward a single decision. He is going to build something. He does not yet know exactly what NVIDIA will become. No one in 1993 could have known. The scale of what is coming, the GPU revolution, the machine learning explosion, the remaking of artificial intelligence around the parallel processing architectures he is about to pioneer, is beyond what any reasonable forecast could have predicted. But Jensen Huang does not need to see the full horizon. He only needs to see far enough to take the next step. And the next step in early 1993 is clear. It is time to begin. Chapter 4. The Denny's Covenant, 1993 to 1995. There are places where history is made that know nothing of the history being made in them. The great rooms of power, the marble halls, the boardrooms with their floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking city skylines, the conference centers with their catered lunches and their laminated name tags, these are the places where history is announced. But history is rarely made there. History is made in the unglamorous in-between spaces. In kitchens and dormitories and garages and, on a particular Tuesday in January of 1993, in a Denny's restaurant in San Jose, California. The date is January 25, 1993. The place is unremarkable by design. Denny's is the great democratic institution of the American roadside, open at all hours, welcoming to everyone, asking nothing of its customers except that they sit down and order something and leave a reasonable tip. The lighting is fluorescent. The menu is laminated. The coffee arrives in thick ceramic mugs that have been through the industrial dishwasher so many times they no longer reflect light. There is nothing here to suggest significance. There is nothing here to suggest that 3 men sitting in a booth are about to make a decision that will, over the following 3 decades, reshape the entire architecture of modern computing. Jensen Huang is 30 years old. He sits across from 2 men he has come to trust. Chris Malachowski and Curtis Preem, both engineers from Sun Microsystems, both possessed of the particular kind of technical depth that takes years to accumulate and cannot be faked. They are not young men in the romantic startup sense, not 22-year-old prodigies operating on caffeine and the innocent conviction that they can change the world before they fully understand it. They are experienced engineers. They have worked inside large, serious companies. They have seen how the industry operates from the inside. They know what they are proposing. They know, with a clarity that only experience provides, exactly how difficult it is going to be. They order coffee. They talk. The conversation that unfolds in that Denny's booth is not, in the way of dramatic scenes, a single thunderclap of revelation. It is the culmination of a longer thinking, threads of intuition and analysis that each of the 3 men has been pulling at independently from different angles, in different companies, and which have now converged in this booth, in this light over these ceramic mugs, into something coherent enough to act on. The thesis is this. Computing, as it currently exists, is organized around a lie. Not a malicious lie, a structural one. The assumption buried in the architecture of every computer built in 1993 is that computation is fundamentally sequential. One instruction follows another. The processor takes a task, completes it, takes the next task, completes that. The CPU, the central processing unit, the crown monarch of the computing world, is extraordinarily good at this. It is fast and flexible and general purpose, and for the vast majority of what computers are asked to do, it is exactly what is needed. But three-dimensional graphics are not like the vast majority of what computers are asked to do. Rendering a three-dimensional scene in real time, translating the mathematical description of a world of objects and light sources and surfaces and shadows into the two-dimensional grid of pixels that appears on a monitor, is not a sequential problem. It is a massively parallel problem. Every pixel on the screen must be calculated independently, its color and brightness determined by its position in three-dimensional space relative to the light sources and the camera angle, its surface properties, its relationship to other objects in the scene. A screen with 1,000,000 pixels requires 1,000,000 simultaneous calculations. And those calculations must be performed fast enough, 30 times per second, 60 times per second, ideally faster, that the human eye perceives not a series of still images but continuous motion. The CPU cannot do this. Not well, not at the frame rates that the emerging generation of three-dimensional video games demands, not without sacrificing the general-purpose flexibility that makes it valuable for everything else. The CPU is a genius at serial tasks and a bottleneck at parallel ones. It is not a design flaw, it is a design choice made for good reasons that happens to be badly matched to the specific demands of real-time three-dimensional rendering. What is needed, what the three men in this Denny's booth believe with a conviction that is part technical analysis and part genuine faith, is a different kind of processor entirely. A processor designed not for the rapid sequential execution of diverse tasks but for the simultaneous execution of thousands of identical tasks. A processor that does not do one thing quickly but many things at once. A graphics processing unit. The GPU. They are not the first people to have this idea. Graphics hardware exists in 1993. Workstations and arcade machines use specialized chips to handle visual computation. But what Huang and Malachowski and Preem are proposing is something different in scale and in ambition. They are not proposing a specialized chip for a specialized market. They are proposing that three-dimensional graphics will become a mass-market demand, that the video game industry, which in 1993 is still regarded by most serious technology investors as a peripheral and somewhat juvenile sector, will drive consumer demand for parallel processing hardware to a scale that will justify the enormous engineering investment required to build it properly. They are betting that games will change computing. Most of the serious people in the serious rooms of the technology industry would have found this thesis questionable at best. Video games are entertainment. They are a consumer product, volatile in their tastes and modest in their margins. The real money in computing in 1993 is in enterprise software, in database systems, in the workstations used by engineers and scientists and financial analysts. The idea that a teenager playing a video game in a suburban bedroom is the leading edge of a computational revolution would have struck most industry analysts as charming but naive. Jensen Huang is not naive. He is a decade into his career. He has designed chips at AMD and managed divisions at LSI Logic and earned a master's degree at Stanford and thought about this problem from more angles than most people in the room are aware of. His conviction is not the conviction of someone who has not done the analysis. It is the conviction of someone who has done the analysis and found, at the end of it, not uncertainty but clarity. The bet is correct. He knows it. They decide to start a company. The name requires thought. Names matter. Not just as brands but as commitments, as statements of intention, as the first act of the storytelling that will eventually define how the world understands what you are building. Jensen Huang thinks about the name with the same systematic care he brings to technical problems. He arrives at something derived from the Latin word NVIDIA, meaning envy, but shaped and softened into something that sounds, as he will later put it, like a mystical place. NVIDIA. It carries a linguistic echo of India, of something ancient and vast and not entirely explicable by ordinary logic. But there is a second layer of intention in the name, and it reveals something important about how Jensen Huang thinks about risk. He reasons explicitly that if the graphics business fails, if the bet on parallel computing for three-dimensional rendering turns out to be wrong or early or aimed at the wrong market, the name NVIDIA sounds sufficiently mysterious and nonspecific that the company could pivot, could become something else, could enter a different industry without carrying the burden of a name that announces a single purpose. This is not pessimism. It is the strategic thinking of someone who has learned, from a childhood of navigating unpredictable circumstances, that the ability to adapt is not a fallback plan but a core competency. You build the best possible version of your primary vision. And you do not remove the exit entirely. They launch. The initial capital is $40,000. Let that number sit in context for a moment. $40,000 in 1993 to start a semiconductor company, an industry where the design of a single chip requires years of engineering work and millions of dollars in fabrication costs. The gap between the ambition and the resources is not a gap. It is a chasm. It is the kind of chasm that stops most people before they begin, that converts bold ideas into cautious ones and cautious ones into abandoned ones. Jensen Huang does not look at the chasm and recalibrate his ambition downward. He looks at the chasm and begins building a bridge. The mentality that governs those early months is captured in a phrase that Huang himself has used to describe the founding spirit. How hard can it be? This phrase has the surface quality of bravado, the cheerful overconfidence of someone who has not yet discovered how hard it can be. But it is something more deliberate than that. It is a cognitive choice. A decision to approach a genuinely difficult problem without the paralysis of over-anticipating its difficulty. To begin moving before the full weight of the obstacle is known, because if you wait until the full weight is known, you will never begin. Jensen Huang learned this at Oneida. When the world gives you nothing but the task in front of you and your own interior resources, you stop calculating the odds and you start doing the work. The doing is the only path through. They move quickly to secure real capital. $20 million arrives in venture funding, a number that is relative to the ambition of the project, still modest, but which provides the runway necessary to begin building in earnest. With this money they hire engineers. They rent space. They begin the long, difficult, technically demanding process of designing from scratch a processor that has never existed before, aimed at a market that is still in the process of discovering what it wants, running on a thesis that most of their competitors regard as either premature or misguided. The central technical challenge is real and formidable. A graphics processor for three-dimensional rendering must handle what engineers call the geometry pipeline and the rasterization pipeline, the sequence of mathematical transformations that begins with a three-dimensional description of a scene and ends with a two-dimensional grid of colored pixels. Every polygon in the scene must be transformed, clipped, projected, shaded, textured, and ultimately converted into pixel data. These operations are not sequential. They are massively, beautifully parallel, a cascading waterfall of simultaneous computation that is, in architectural terms, almost the exact inverse of what the CPU was designed to do. To build a chip that handles this efficiently, you must make fundamental decisions about how to organize the silicon. How many processing units to include. How to manage memory bandwidth. The rate at which data can be moved between the processor and the memory that stores the scene information. How to handle the pipeline so that no stage becomes a bottleneck that starves the others of data. These are not simple decisions. Each one involves trade-offs that ripple through the entire design, and the only way to evaluate the trade-offs is to understand both the mathematical requirements of the rendering task and the physical constraints of the silicon on which it will be implemented. Huang, Malachowski, and Preem are equipped for this. Collectively, they carry exactly the combination of skills the problem requires: deep chip design experience, familiarity with graphics workloads, and the management capability to coordinate a team of engineers working simultaneously on different pieces of a system that must ultimately function as a coherent whole. The work is hard. Of course it is hard. How hard can it be? Very hard. Extraordinarily hard. The kind of hard that breaks companies and careers and marriages, that turns promising engineers into bitter former employees, that converts $20 million into nothing but a pile of design files and a company name with no product to show for it. But this is not that story. This is the story of three men who sat in a Denny's booth in San Jose and made a covenant, not a formal one, not written on anything more durable than the back of a napkin in the imagination, but a real one nonetheless. A commitment to a thesis. A commitment to each other. A commitment to the idea that the future of computing would be parallel, that the first mass-market application of that future would be games, and that if they could build the right processor at the right time at the right price, they could position themselves at the center of a revolution that most of the industry had not yet learned to see. They have $40,000 and a name that sounds like a mystical place and the particular, quiet, immovable conviction of people who have done the analysis and found, at the end of it, not doubt but certainty. The covenant is made. The work begins. Outside, San Jose continues its ordinary January business. The traffic moving along the highways that connect the valley's dozen interchangeable business parks, the coffee shops filling with the morning's ambitions, the semiconductor companies running their fabs and their design centers and their quarterly reviews in the assumption that the landscape of their industry is roughly settled, that the important architectural decisions have been made, that the future broadly looks like the present only faster. Inside a Denny's, 3 men leave a tip on a table and walk out into the California winter with an idea that will prove all of that wrong. The revolution has just ordered coffee. Chapter 5. The Near-Death Experience, 1995 to 1999. Every company that survives long enough to become legendary has, somewhere in its past, a moment when it should have died. Not a difficult moment. Not a challenging quarter or a missed product cycle or a competitive threat that required a strategic pivot. A moment of genuine terminal crisis. When the money is almost gone and the product is broken and the employees are frightened and the rational analysis of the situation points clearly and unambiguously toward the end. Most companies that reach that moment do not survive it. They wind down gracefully or ungracefully, their assets acquired for parts, their engineers dispersed into other organizations, their founding vision quietly archived in the memory of the people who believed in it. NVIDIA reaches that moment in 1995. And the story of how it survives, the specific, improbable, character-revealing sequence of decisions and honesty and luck that pulls the company back from the edge, is, in many ways, the most important story in Jensen Huang's career. Because what happens in this period does not merely save a company. It defines one. It establishes, at the cellular level of NVIDIA's culture, a set of convictions about urgency and transparency and the relationship between failure and survival that will govern the organization for the next 3 decades. But to understand the crisis, you must first understand the mistake. The NV1 is NVIDIA's first chip. It is, in conception, ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, in the way that first products often are when the people designing them are trying to prove everything at once. The NV1 is designed to be a multifunctional processor. Not merely a graphics chip but a device that handles 3-dimensional rendering, audio processing and gain controller inputs simultaneously. It is a statement of capability, an announcement to the industry that this new company from San Jose is not thinking small. The 3-dimensional rendering approach the NV1 employs is built around a technique called quadrilateral rendering. Rather than decomposing 3-dimensional surfaces into triangles, the approach that most graphics hardware of the era uses, and for good mathematical reasons, the NV1 works with quadrilaterals, 4-sided polygons. The team believes this approach has advantages, and they are not wrong in a narrow technical sense. But they are wrong in a broader strategic sense, and the distinction between those two kinds of wrong will nearly destroy them. In 1995, Microsoft announces DirectX. The significance of this announcement cannot be overstated. DirectX is an application programming interface, a standardized set of tools that allows game developers to write graphics code that works reliably across different hardware configurations. Before DirectX, the PC gaming landscape is a fragmented mess. Game developers must write specialized code for each different graphics chip, a burden that is expensive and time-consuming and that limits the ambitions of everyone in the ecosystem. DirectX promises to end that fragmentation. It promises a common language. The common language it chooses is triangle-based rendering. In an instant, not gradually, not over a product cycle, but immediately and completely, the quadrilateral approach embedded in the NV1 becomes not merely technically suboptimal but strategically incompatible with the standard that will define the entire future of PC gaming. Microsoft has, with a single announcement, made NVIDIA's first chip obsolete before the market has fully formed. The NV1 does not merely fail to succeed. It fails to be relevant. The company begins to collapse. Employees leave. Not one or two, most of them. The layoffs are not a controlled reduction in force, the kind of carefully managed restructuring that large companies perform with HR consultants and severance packages and carefully worded internal communications. This is a small company running out of money, shedding headcount because it cannot afford the payroll, watching its workforce dissolve under the pressure of a crisis that has no obvious solution. Jensen Huang, in this period, does something that will become one of the defining practices of his leadership. He looks directly at the worst version of the truth and refuses to look away. He does not construct a narrative in which the situation is manageable. He does not ask his remaining team to maintain confidence in a product that he knows is broken. He acknowledges, internally and with the unflinching clarity that Oneida taught him and a decade of engineering experience confirmed, exactly how bad things are. 30 days. That is the number that will become, in the years that follow, one of NVIDIA's most important unofficial truths. The company in its darkest period is 30 days from going out of business. Not 60. Not 90. 30. The payroll can be met for another month, and after that, absent a dramatic change in circumstances, there is nothing. This is not a metaphor. It is a cash flow analysis. Huang will carry this number forward long after the crisis has passed. He will build it into the culture of NVIDIA as a permanent orientation toward urgency. A reminder, delivered not in moments of difficulty but at all times, that the comfort of success is an illusion, that the distance between a thriving company and a failed one is shorter than it looks from the inside, and that the only reliable protection against catastrophe is to behave as though catastrophe is always possible. Always 30 days away. But in 1995, the 30 days is not a philosophical stance. It is a fact. And somewhere in the remaining structure of the company, there is a lifeline. It comes from Japan. Sega. The Japanese gaming giant has contracted NVIDIA to build the graphics chip for the successor to the Saturn, its next-generation home console, a product on which Sega is betting a substantial portion of its competitive future. The contract represents real money. Money that NVIDIA desperately needs. Money that, if it continues to flow, could provide the runway necessary to attempt what would otherwise be impossible, scrapping the existing architecture entirely and starting over. But there is a problem. The chip NVIDIA is building for Sega is built on the same quadrilateral architecture as the NV1. The same fundamental approach that Microsoft's DirectX has rendered incompatible with the future of the industry. NVIDIA is, in effect, building Sega a product that Jensen Huang knows, with the certainty of a man who has done the analysis, will fail in the market. He could continue. He could deliver the chip as contracted. He could take Sega's money, complete the project, hand over the hardware, and buy himself some time. Other companies in this situation have done exactly this, delivered the product, collected the payment, and left the customer to discover the product's inadequacy on their own. It is not admirable, but it is understandable. When a company is 30 days from insolvency, the temptation to defer honesty in favor of survival is enormous. Jensen Huang gets on a plane to Japan. He sits across from the CEO of Sega, and he tells the truth. Not a softened version of the truth. Not a carefully managed disclosure designed to minimize the commercial damage while technically fulfilling the obligation of transparency. The truth. The product they are building is fundamentally flawed. The quadrilateral architecture is incompatible with the direction the industry is moving. The chip NVIDIA is developing for Sega's next console will not succeed in the market. If Sega launches a console built around this hardware, the console will be at a structural disadvantage relative to competitors who are building on triangle-based, DirectX-compatible architectures. And this is the moment that requires the specific psychological fortitude that was forged in a reform school in Kentucky and refined through a decade of engineering and management. He makes a request. He asks Sega to continue funding the contract. Not to fund the delivery of the promised chip. That chip, he has just explained, is not worth building. He asks Sega to fund the abandonment of that chip. To pay for the time and resources necessary for NVIDIA to scrap everything it has built, redesign the architecture from scratch on a triangle-based foundation compatible with the industry standard, and deliver something that will actually work. He is asking a business partner to pay for his company's mistake. He is doing so by first confessing that the mistake is his. He is sitting in a meeting room in Japan with his company 30 days from collapse, and he is betting everything, not on a clever negotiating strategy but on the possibility that honesty, delivered without deflection or qualification, will be received as the rarest and most valuable thing one business partner can offer another. Sega agrees. Let that resolution settle because it is extraordinary. Sega, a Japanese corporation with every commercial justification to walk away from a contractor who has just admitted that the contracted product is a failure, chooses instead to continue the relationship. Perhaps they recognize the integrity of the disclosure. Perhaps they calculate that the alternative, finding a new graphics partner and starting over entirely, is worse. Perhaps the Sega CEO, sitting across from a 30-year-old American who has just flown halfway around the world to tell him the bad news in person, recognizes something in Jensen Huang that is worth backing. Whatever the reason, the money continues to flow. And NVIDIA begins again. The new architecture is built on triangles. It is built for DirectX compliance. It is built with the knowledge, now written in scar tissue across the entire organization, of what happens when you design a product in isolation from the standards that will govern the market it enters. The engineers who remain, the skeleton crew that survive the layoffs, work with the particular intensity of people who understand that the stakes are not abstract. This is not a challenging project. This is the last project. If this one fails, there is nothing after it. It does not fail. The Riva 128 arrives in 1997. It is triangle-based. It is DirectX compliant. It is fast, genuinely, impressively fast, capable of rendering three-dimensional graphics at frame rates that the market has not seen before at this price point. It sells 1 million units in its first 4 months. For a company that was 30 days from extinction 2 years earlier, this is not merely a commercial success. It is a resurrection. The industry takes notice. NVIDIA, the small company from San Jose that almost didn't survive its first chip, has delivered something real. The momentum builds. The engineering team, now expanded and energized by the success of the Riva 128, begins working on what will become the most significant product in NVIDIA's young history. It is called the GeForce 256. And when it arrives in 1999, Jensen Huang makes a claim on its behalf that is also a declaration of intent. He calls it the world's first GPU. The graphics processing unit. Not a graphics accelerator, not a graphics chip, not a specialized processor for rendering tasks. A graphics processing unit, a term that asserts in its very construction that what NVIDIA has built is not an accessory to the CPU but a peer. A processor in its own right. A computational architecture with its own domain, its own capabilities, its own claim on the hierarchy of the modern computer. The claim is substantiated by the technology. The GeForce 256 moves what engineers call transform and lighting calculations, the mathematical operations that determine how three-dimensional objects are positioned and illuminated in a scene, from the CPU onto the chip itself. Before the GeForce 256, these calculations are performed by the CPU and handed off to the graphics hardware for rasterization. After it, the entire pipeline lives on the GPU. The CPU is freed from a computational burden it was never designed to carry efficiently. The visual results are dramatic. Games look better. Scenes are more complex. Lighting is more realistic. The gap between what computers can render and what the human eye finds convincing narrows in a way that players can see and feel. The industry restructures itself around this new hierarchy. And NVIDIA goes public. The IPO arrives in 1999, at the height of the first great technology boom, and the market receives NVIDIA with the enthusiasm that accompanies the recognition of something genuinely new. The stock price rises. It rises past thresholds that would have been unimaginable in the Denny's booth 6 years earlier, unimaginable in the dark months of 1995 when the payroll was uncertain and the architecture was broken and the company was 30 days from the end. When the stock price hits $100 per share, Jensen Huang does something that is, on its surface, impulsive and slightly absurd and entirely in character. He gets a tattoo. The NVIDIA logo pressed permanently into the skin of his left shoulder. It is not a subtle gesture. It is a public commitment, a declaration that this company, this vision, this bet placed in a Denny's booth and nearly lost in the crisis of the NV1 and saved by a flight to Japan and an act of radical honesty, is not something he does. It is something he is. The logo on his shoulder is the external marking of an internal truth that has been true since January 25, 1993. Jensen Huang and NVIDIA are not separable. The tattoo will age. The shoulder will change. The company will grow beyond anything the man getting the tattoo in 1999 can fully imagine. But the commitment it represents, to the vision, to the people, to the 30 days from oblivion urgency that keeps the organization honest, that commitment does not age. It only deepens. The near-death experience of 1995 is behind them now. The Riva 128 and the GeForce 256 and the IPO have placed NVIDIA on a trajectory that the industry is beginning to take seriously. But the lesson of those dark months is not behind them. Jensen Huang will not allow it to be. He carries it forward, into every all-hands meeting and every product review and every moment when success might tempt the organization toward the comfortable assumption that the hard part is over. The hard part is never over. There are always 30 days left. And the only way to ensure there are 30 days after those is to behave, every single day, as though the survival of everything you have built depends on what you do next. Because it does. It always has. Chapter 6. Invention of the GPU, 1999 to 2006. There is a particular kind of genius that the technology industry tends to undervalue. It is not the genius of the single breakthrough, the flash of insight that produces one extraordinary thing and then rests on the authority of that thing for years or decades. The technology industry celebrates that kind of genius enthusiastically, builds mythology around it, names buildings and awards after it. But there is another kind, quieter and in many ways more demanding, that does not produce one extraordinary thing but rather an unrelenting succession of extraordinary things, each one building on the last, each one pushing the frontier forward before the market has fully absorbed the implications of the previous advance. This is the genius of relentless iteration. And in the years between 1999 and 2006, Jensen Huang and NVIDIA practice it with an intensity that the semiconductor industry has never quite seen before and has struggled to replicate since. The IPO of 1999 is not, for Jensen Huang, a moment of arrival. It is a moment of acceleration. The capital markets have validated the vision, the stock price has provided the tattoo, and the GeForce 256 has established NVIDIA as the author of a new category of processor. But validation is not the goal. The goal is a moving target, always receding, always demanding another advance, always requiring that the engineering team find the next frontier before the competition finds it first. The question that governs NVIDIA in the early 2000s is deceptively simple. What should a GPU be able to do? In 1999, the answer is relatively clear. A GPU should handle the fixed computational pipeline of three-dimensional rendering, the transform and lighting calculations, the rasterization, the pixel-level operations that produce the final image on screen. This pipeline is well understood. Its stages are defined. The GPU's job is to execute those stages as quickly and efficiently as possible, in parallel, across the millions of pixels and thousands of polygons that comprise a modern three-dimensional scene. But clarity for Jensen Huang is never an excuse for stillness. He drives the engineering team at a pace that is, by the standards of the semiconductor industry, almost unreasonable. The traditional cadence of chip development, the cycle that CPU manufacturers like Intel have established as the natural rhythm of the industry, runs approximately 2 years. Design a chip. Tape it out. Fabricate it. Test it. Validate it. Ship it. Begin the next one. 2 years, give or take, between major architectural generations. NVIDIA, in the early 2000s, is operating on a cycle of 6 to 12 months. This is not merely a faster version of the same process. It is a different process, organized around a different philosophy. Traditional chip development assumes that the architecture is largely stable and that improvement is primarily a function of manufacturing advances. Smaller transistors, denser circuits, more performance from the same design at a smaller node. Jensen Huang's approach assumes that the architecture itself must change, continuously and fundamentally, that the definition of what a GPU is and what it can do must expand with every generation, and that the only way to stay ahead of competitors who are watching your every move and attempting to replicate your best ideas is to move faster than replication is possible. The competitive landscape is crowded and brutal. 3DFX Interactive, which dominated the consumer graphics card market in the late 1990s with its Voodoo series, is the most visible rival. 3DFX is a genuine engineering organization, capable of producing excellent hardware and backed by real resources and real talent. But it cannot match the cadence. NVIDIA releases new architectures faster than 3DFX can respond to the previous ones. By the time 3DFX engineers have studied an NVIDIA product and begun designing a competitive response, NVIDIA has already moved to the next generation. It is not a fair fight. It is not designed to be. 3DFX is acquired by NVIDIA in 2000. Not because NVIDIA outspent them. Because NVIDIA outran them. But the pace of hardware iteration is only one dimension of what Jensen Huang is building in this period. The other dimension, less visible to the consumer who buys a graphics card and installs it in their computer, but equally important to the competitive position NVIDIA is establishing, is software. The relationship between hardware and software in the GPU business is not, as it might appear from the outside, a simple one-way dependency. It is not merely that software runs on hardware. In the GPU business, the software defines what the hardware can become. The driver, the software layer that translates the programming interface used by game developers into the specific instructions that the GPU's circuits execute, is not a passive conduit. It is an active interpreter, and its quality determines, in ways that are often invisible to the end user, the difference between a graphics card that delivers its theoretical performance and one that delivers something less. Jensen Huang understands this with a depth of conviction that is unusual even in an industry full of people who understand software. He has articulated, in this period, a philosophy that might be called driver before silicon. The idea that the software layer that will run on a new chip must be designed alongside the chip itself, not after it, that the programming model available to developers must be considered a first-class design constraint rather than a downstream implementation detail. This philosophy has practical consequences. NVIDIA invests heavily in driver development at a time when many of its competitors treat drivers as a necessary but secondary concern, something to be completed after the hardware is finished, rather than developed in parallel with it. The result is that NVIDIA's hardware, in the hands of game developers, consistently performs closer to its theoretical maximum than competing hardware. The driver is not leaking performance. The driver is delivering it. Game developers notice. And in the GPU business, the relationship with game developers is not a marketing consideration. It is a technical one. Games push hardware to its limits in ways that synthetic benchmarks never can. The feedback that flows from game developers back to NVIDIA's engineering team, the specific rendering techniques they want to use, the features they need that the current architecture does not support, the performance characteristics that are limiting their artistic ambitions. This feedback is the most valuable engineering data NVIDIA has access to. Jensen Huang builds and cultivates this feedback loop with the deliberateness of someone who understands that the relationship between a platform and its developer ecosystem is not a feature of a successful business. It is the business. The architectural evolution of the GPU in this period is, viewed from a sufficient distance, a story of progressive liberation. The first generation of GPU architectures, the GeForce 256 and its immediate successors, implement a fixed pipeline. The stages of the rendering process are defined in hardware, and developers can configure them but cannot fundamentally alter them. This is a reasonable design choice for a first-generation architecture. Fixed pipelines are efficient, predictable, and easier to optimize. But they are also limiting. Game developers who are trying to achieve visual effects that the fixed pipeline was not designed to produce, must work around the constraints of the hardware rather than expressing their artistic intentions directly. The industry's answer to this limitation is the programmable shader. Shaders are small programs that run on the GPU and determine, at the pixel level, how surfaces are lit and colored. Rather than accepting the fixed lighting and shading calculations built into the hardware, developers can write their own, can specify in code exactly how light interacts with a particular surface, how shadows fall, how atmospheric effects are rendered, how the appearance of materials changes under different lighting conditions. The programmable shader transforms the GPU from a fixed-function appliance into a genuinely programmable computing device. NVIDIA introduces programmable pixel shaders with the GeForce 2 generation in 2000. The visual results are immediate and striking. Games can now render surfaces with a fidelity and realism that the fixed pipeline never permitted. Water moves and refracts light. Metal reflects its environment. Skin has a translucency that makes digital characters look less like plastic mannequins and more like something alive. But Jensen Huang is not thinking only about what shaders can do for games. He is thinking about something larger, an implication of the programmable shader that most of his contemporaries have not yet fully processed. If the GPU is programmable, it is not merely a graphics processor. It is a parallel computing engine that happens to be optimized for graphics. The same architecture that renders pixels, thousands of small processing units, each performing the same operation on different data simultaneously, can, in principle, perform any computation that has the same structural property. Any problem that can be decomposed into thousands of independent parallel operations is, theoretically, a problem the GPU can attack. The recognition of this possibility is not, in 2000 or 2001 or even 2003, a formed strategy for NVIDIA. It is a direction, a horizon, a sense, gathering in Jensen Huang's mind with the particular quality of intuitions that are not yet actionable but are not going away, that the GPU is going to mean something beyond games. He files the insight away. He continues building. The GeForce 6 series, arriving in 2004, pushes the programmable architecture further. The shader units become more flexible, more powerful, capable of more complex programs. The concepts of a unified shader architecture, in which the same processing units can handle different types of shader workloads rather than being divided into fixed categories, begin to take shape. The GPU is becoming something more general even as it continues to become more capable at its primary task. Through all of this, Jensen Huang is refining a philosophy that has its roots in the failure of the NV1. The NV1 was, among its other failures, a product that tried to do too many things: graphics, audio, game controllers, all in one chip. It was a product built on the assumption that breadth of capability was a competitive advantage. The market taught him otherwise. The market taught him that in a world of limited engineering resources and aggressive competition, the attempt to be excellent at everything is usually the path to being excellent at nothing. Do fewer things extremely well. This is not a management cliché for Jensen Huang. It is a lesson written in the experience of watching a company nearly die because it spread itself too thin. NVIDIA, in the years after the NV1, focuses. It focuses on the GPU. Not on the GPU plus audio. Not on the GPU plus networking. Not on the GPU plus whatever adjacent market seems attractive in a given quarter. The GPU. The graphics processing unit. The specialized parallel computing architecture for visual workloads and, increasingly, the platform on which the future of computing will be built. This focus has a compounding quality. Every engineering decision made in service of GPU performance reinforces every previous engineering decision made in service of GPU performance. The architecture accumulates depth. The driver software accumulates sophistication. The developer relationships accumulate trust and feedback and the particular kind of institutional knowledge that only comes from years of working on the same hard problem with the same committed partners. The competitive moat NVIDIA is building in these years is not made of patents or manufacturing advantages or distribution relationships, though all of those exist. It is made of depth, of the accumulated consequence of choosing over and over again to go deeper rather than broader, to understand the GPU more completely than any competitor understands it, to build software that expresses that understanding, to cultivate relationships with the people who push the hardware to its limits and whose feedback drives the next generation of advance. By the middle of the decade, the evidence of this strategy is visible in the industry's most consequential hardware decisions. Microsoft is building the original Xbox. The console needs a GPU. NVIDIA wins the contract. The decision is not made on price alone. It is made on the basis of technical capability and the confidence that NVIDIA's engineering team can deliver at the performance levels the console requires on the schedule the launch demands. Sony is designing the PlayStation 3. The architecture is more complex. The cell processor at its core is Sony's own radical bet on a new kind of computing, but the GPU at the heart of the system's graphics capability is an NVIDIA design. The world's two largest gaming console platforms, competing fiercely against each other, are both built on NVIDIA silicon. This is not a coincidence. It is the consequence of 7 years of relentless iteration, of driver-before-silicon discipline, of doing fewer things extremely well, of building relationships with developers who trust the hardware because the hardware has earned that trust through consistent, reliable, ever-improving performance. And all the while, in the background of the gaming story, the larger story is forming. The GPU is becoming a computing platform. The programmable shader is becoming a general-purpose parallel processor. The researchers and scientists who have been watching the GPU's architectural evolution from outside the gaming industry are beginning to ask whether the hardware that renders water and light in a video game might also be capable of simulating the behavior of molecules, or training statistical models, or processing the enormous data sets that scientific computing generates. Jensen Huang is watching these questions emerge. He is listening to the people asking them. The direction that began as a horizon is becoming a road. But that is the next chapter. For now, in 2006, NVIDIA is a company that has invented a category, dominated that category through relentless iteration and disciplined focus, and built a platform whose full potential even its creator has not yet fully described. Huang's law is real. The GPU's performance is doubling faster than Moore's law predicts for general-purpose processors. The curve is steep and it is not flattening. The question is no longer whether NVIDIA can keep pace with the demands of the gaming market. The question, forming quietly, urgently, at the edges of the engineering conversations happening inside NVIDIA's Santa Clara offices, is whether the gaming market is actually the point. Chapter 7. The CUDA Insurgency, 2006 to 2012. There is a particular kind of decision that cannot be justified in the present tense. It cannot be defended with a spreadsheet because the numbers do not support it. It cannot be validated by market research because the market it addresses does not yet exist. It cannot be explained to investors in the language of quarterly returns because the return, if it comes at all, is years away and the cost is immediate, and the gap between the cost and the return will be filled for an uncomfortably long time, with nothing but conviction. This kind of decision requires something rarer than intelligence. It requires the willingness to be wrong in public for an extended period of time, to absorb the skepticism of people whose skepticism is not unreasonable, to continue building something that most of the world cannot yet see the point of, because you can see the point with a clarity that is, for the moment, yours alone. In 2006, Jensen Huang makes this kind of decision. He calls it CUDA. The full name is Compute Unified Device Architecture, and the technical description: a parallel computing platform and programming model that allows developers to write code in standard languages like C, C++, and Fortran that runs directly on the thousands of processing cores inside an NVIDIA GPU, is accurate but insufficient. It describes what CUDA is. It does not describe what CUDA means. What CUDA means is this. Jensen Huang has decided that the GPU is not a graphics processor that also happens to be capable of general computation. The GPU is a general computing platform that also happens to be excellent at graphics. This is not a refinement of the previous understanding. It is a reversal of it. And the implications of that reversal in 2006 are visible only to a small number of people. A handful of researchers, a few forward-looking engineers, and the CEO of NVIDIA, who has spent the better part of a decade watching the GPU become something he is now ready to declare it has always been becoming. To understand why CUDA is a gamble of the first order, you must understand the economics of the decision. NVIDIA's business in 2006 is graphics. Consumer graphics cards sold to gamers who want their games to look better and run faster. Professional graphics cards sold to engineers and designers and visual effects artists who need reliable high-performance rendering. Console GPU designs sold to Microsoft and Sony for the machines that sit in living rooms around the world. This is a real business, a profitable business, a growing business, a business that has been built over 13 years of engineering excellence and competitive ferocity and the accumulated trust of developers and platform holders who have learned that NVIDIA delivers. CUDA proposes to take this business and complicate it. Significantly. Expensively. To support CUDA on every GPU, not just on specialized high-performance computing cards aimed at researchers, but on every consumer GeForce card sold at every price point, NVIDIA must build additional circuitry into every chip it manufactures. It must develop and maintain a software stack of extraordinary complexity: compilers, runtime environments, debugging tools, profiling tools, the full apparatus of a professional software development platform. It must train a developer community that does not yet exist, in a programming model that is genuinely different from anything most software engineers have encountered, for applications whose commercial value has not yet been demonstrated. The cost of all of this is not a line item. It is a sustained, multi-year, multi-billion-dollar commitment that flows out of NVIDIA's earnings before it produces a single dollar of return from the CUDA platform specifically. Wall Street does not like this. The analysts who cover NVIDIA in the years following the CUDA launch are not hostile to the company. They understand the gaming business, they respect the execution track record, they appreciate the competitive position NVIDIA has built. But they are paid to evaluate returns, and the returns from CUDA are, in the near term, negative. The R&D expenditure is visible. The revenue is not. Quarter after quarter, the investment continues and the gaming market pays for it, and the investors who own NVIDIA stock because of its position in gaming find themselves also owning, without having chosen to, a long-term bet on a market that most of them cannot adequately evaluate. Jensen Huang sits in the earnings calls. He listens to the skeptical questions. He answers them with a patience that is characteristic, not the false patience of someone suppressing frustration, but the genuine patience of someone who understands that the questioners are not wrong to be skeptical. They simply do not have access to what he can see. What he can see begins with a wall. The CPU in 2006 is approaching a set of physical limits that the industry has been aware of for years but has managed to defer through successive manufacturing improvements. The fundamental performance scaling that Intel and AMD have delivered for 3 decades, the doubling of transistor density, the increasing of clock speeds, the reliable improvement in serial processing performance that Gordon Moore described in 1965, is beginning to encounter the unyielding physics of heat and power consumption. You can only run a processor so fast before the energy required to run it faster becomes the energy required to melt it. The era of simply making the CPU clock faster is ending. The industry's response to this constraint is the multi-core processor. Rather than making one CPU core faster, put 2 cores, then 4, then 8 on the same die, and allow software to distribute work across them. This is, in a limited sense, parallel processing. But it is parallel processing at a coarse granularity, with 2 or 4 or 8 large, flexible, general-purpose cores, each designed to handle diverse tasks independently. The GPU has thousands of cores. Small cores, specialized cores, cores designed not for flexibility but for the specific task of performing the same mathematical operation simultaneously on thousands of different pieces of data. The GPU is not a better CPU. It is a different kind of computer designed for a different kind of problem. And there are, Jensen Huang believes, enormously important problems that have exactly the structure the GPU is built for. Scientific simulation, molecular dynamics, the computational modeling of how atoms and molecules move and interact, the foundation of drug discovery and materials science and climate modeling. Computational fluid dynamics, the mathematical description of how gases and liquids flow, essential to aerospace engineering and weather forecasting and the design of everything from turbine blades to blood pumps. Financial modeling, image processing, the numerical methods that underlie virtually every branch of computational science. These are not trivial applications. They are among the most important computational workloads in human knowledge production. And many of them are structurally identical to the rendering workloads the GPU was built to handle. Massive collections of independent parallel operations, performed simultaneously on large datasets, where the bottleneck is not the complexity of individual operations but the sheer number of them. A handful of researchers have already noticed this. Before CUDA, a small and heroic community of computational scientists has been attempting to use GPU hardware for general computation by encoding their problems as fake graphics operations, tricking the GPU into performing scientific calculations by disguising them as rendering tasks. It is a profoundly inelegant approach. It requires expertise in graphics programming that most scientists do not have, produces code that is nearly impossible to maintain, and delivers performance that, while impressive, is a fraction of what the hardware could theoretically provide if it were designed to be used this way. CUDA removes the disguise. With CUDA, a computational physicist or a molecular biologist or a financial mathematician can write code in the languages they already know, C, C++, Fortran, and run it directly on the GPU without pretending it is a rendering operation. The abstraction layer that CUDA provides is not merely a convenience. It is a fundamental shift in what the GPU is, from the perspective of the scientific and technical computing community. It is the difference between a tool that can be repurposed with effort and a tool that is designed for the purpose. The strategy embedded in the CUDA decision is one that Jensen Huang has studied deeply and understands intimately. The challenge facing any platform company, and NVIDIA is with CUDA declaring itself a platform company, not merely a hardware manufacturer, is the chicken and egg problem of developer ecosystems. Developers will not invest in learning a new platform until there is a large installed base of users who will benefit from their investment. Users will not seek out a platform until there is a rich ecosystem of applications that makes it valuable. The platform cannot grow until it has both, and it cannot have both until it has grown. The only way to break this cycle is to subsidize one side. Jensen Huang chooses to subsidize the developer side, and he chooses to do it at scale. By building CUDA support into every consumer GeForce card, every card bought by every student, every gamer, every researcher who also happens to play games, NVIDIA creates an installed base that is, in the language of platform economics, enormous before the platform has a meaningful application ecosystem. Every university computer lab with gaming PCs has CUDA-capable hardware. Every graduate student with a GeForce card has, without knowing it, a parallel supercomputer on their desk. The barrier to entry for experimenting with GPU computing drops from the price of a specialized high-performance computing node to the price of a consumer graphics card that you might already own. The research community notices. Not immediately, change in academic communities moves at the pace of grant cycles and publication timelines and the slow rotation of graduate cohorts. But over months and then years, the CUDA papers begin to appear. Molecular dynamic simulations running 10 times faster on a GPU than on a CPU cluster that costs 20 times as much. Seismic processing for oil exploration completing in hours rather than days. Financial risk calculations that once required overnight batch runs completing in real time. Each paper is a proof of concept. Each proof of concept attracts more researchers. Each researcher who learns CUDA becomes, in effect, an advocate for the platform. A person who, when they advise students or collaborate with industry partners or give conference talks, carries the implicit endorsement of direct positive experience. Jensen Huang is building a community. He is doing it slowly and expensively and without the immediate commercial return that Wall Street would prefer. But he is doing it with the same patient, systematic determination that his mother brought to the dictionary lessons in Southeast Asia. The understanding that the capability you build before you need it is the capability that saves you when you finally do. The financial environment does not cooperate. In 2008, the global financial crisis arrives with the particular violence of events that were theoretically predictable and practically unexpected. Credit markets freeze. Consumer spending contracts. The gaming market, which has been the engine of NVIDIA's revenue, softens as households that are suddenly uncertain about their financial futures postpone the discretionary purchase of a new graphics card. NVIDIA stock, which had been riding the optimism of the technology sector, falls sharply. The pressure to cut costs is real. The pressure to focus, to pull back from the expensive long-horizon investment in CUDA and concentrate resources on the near-term gaming business that pays the bills, is substantial. It comes from investors, from analysts, from the internal logic of a company watching its margins compress in a deteriorating economic environment. Jensen Huang does not pull back. This decision, to continue the CUDA investment through the financial crisis, to absorb the short-term pain rather than sacrifice the long-term platform, is in its own way as consequential as the original CUDA launch. It is easy to make a long-term bet when the environment is favorable. It is the willingness to hold the long-term bet when the environment is hostile that separates the commitments that matter from the commitments that were only commitments when they were easy. The culture he is building inside NVIDIA in this period is designed to support exactly this kind of persistence. The radical candor, the expectation that problems will be identified and communicated and addressed directly, without the organizational smoothing that allows bad news to travel slowly and arrive too late, is not a personality quirk. It is a survival mechanism. A company that cannot hear its own bad news clearly is a company that will be surprised by consequences it could have anticipated. Jensen Huang has learned, from Oneida and from the NV1 and from the flight to Japan, that the honest acknowledgement of a problem is not the same as accepting defeat by that problem. It is the precondition for solving it. He holds people to this standard relentlessly. Not unkindly, the culture of NVIDIA in this period is not a culture of fear, whatever its demands, but uncompromisingly. The expectation is that every person in the organization knows what is true about their area of responsibility and is willing to say it plainly, and that every problem identified is a problem that will be addressed rather than managed. He calls this his maniacal discipline. The word maniacal is chosen deliberately. It is not the word a person uses when they want to suggest moderation. It is the word for a quality of focus that does not accommodate distraction or excuse or the comfortable softening of a standard that was set for good reasons. The years pass. The CUDA installed base grows. The research papers multiply. The applications expand beyond computational science into image processing, signal processing, data analytics, the early and still tentative experiments in machine learning that a small community of researchers is pursuing in the academic margins of the field. And somewhere, in a laboratory at the University of Toronto, a researcher named Geoffrey Hinton and his students are training neural networks on datasets that are getting larger, and finding that the networks are getting better, and beginning to suspect that the thing they are working on is not a curiosity but a revolution. They need hardware that can handle the training of very large neural networks, the simultaneous updating of millions of parameters across enormous datasets, a computational workload that is, in its structure, almost perfectly suited to the parallel processing architecture of the GPU. They have CUDA. Jensen Huang, in 2006, could not have named Geoffrey Hinton's research program as the application that would justify the CUDA investment. He could not have predicted, with specificity, that the killer app for parallel computing would be deep learning. He knew the structure of the bet he was making: subsidize the platform, build the install base, wait for the application to emerge, but he did not know the name of the application. He did not need to. He needed to understand that the GPU was the right architecture for the most important class of computational problems the world would face. He needed to understand that the only way to ensure NVIDIA's hardware would be ready when those problems arrived was to build the software platform before the problems were clearly defined. He needed to be willing to spend the money and absorb the skepticism and maintain the discipline for as long as it took. He did. The revolution is coming. Jensen Huang has spent 6 years building the infrastructure it will need when it arrives. Chapter 8. The Deep Learning Discovery, 2012 to 2019. Sometimes the future announces itself quietly. Not with a press conference or a product launch or a keynote delivered to thousands of people in a darkened arena. Not with a stock price movement or a regulatory filing or a headline in the technology press. Sometimes the future arrives as a number, a single data point, published in the proceedings of an academic competition that most of the world has never heard of, noticed by a small number of people with the technical background to understand what the number means. In the autumn of 2012, the future arrives as an error rate. The competition is called ImageNet Large-Scale Visual Recognition Challenge. It is an annual academic contest in which research teams from universities and corporations around the world submit computer vision systems, software designed to look at a photograph and correctly identify what is in it. The challenge is harder than it sounds. The human visual system, refined over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, handles this task effortlessly and continuously. Building software that can do it reliably has occupied some of the best minds in artificial intelligence for decades, and the progress, while real, has been slow and incremental. a fraction of a percentage point of improvement each year, the accumulated consequence of thousands of engineering decisions made by human experts who have spent their careers studying how machines can be taught to see. In 2012, the best systems in the competition have error rates in the range of 25 to 26%. This is the frontier, the state of the art, the best that human ingenuity has managed to produce through the conventional methods of computer vision. Handcrafted features, carefully designed algorithms, the accumulated expertise of a generation of researchers. A team from the University of Toronto enters the competition with something different. Their names are Alex Krashevsky and Ilya Sutskever, working under the supervision of a researcher named Jeffrey Hinton, a man who has spent the better part of 30 years believing, against the prevailing consensus of his field, that artificial neural networks trained on large amounts of data could eventually do remarkable things. For most of those 30 years, the consensus was not merely skeptical but dismissive. Neural networks were tried in the 1980s. They did not work well enough. The field moved on to other approaches. Hinton did not move on. What Krashevsky and Sutskever have built is called AlexNet. It is a deep convolutional neural network, a software architecture loosely inspired by the structure of biological visual systems, organized in layers that progressively extract higher-level features from raw image data. The network has 60 million parameters, a number that is, by the standards of what has been computationally feasible, enormous. Training it, adjusting those 60 million parameters, iteratively and repeatedly, across a data set of over 1 million labeled images until the network learns to recognize what it is seeing, requires a scale of computation that would have been prohibitive on CPU hardware. They train it on 2 NVIDIA GeForce GTX 580 graphics cards. Consumer cards. The same cards sold to gamers for playing video games. Running CUDA, the software platform that Jensen Huang spent 6 years and billions of dollars building into every GPU NVIDIA manufactured. The investment that Wall Street questioned and competitors dismissed and even some inside the company found difficult to justify in the lean years. AlexNet's error rate in the ImageNet competition is 15.3%. The second-place team, using conventional computer vision methods, achieves 26.2%. The gap between those two numbers, nearly 11 percentage points in a competition where annual improvements are measured in fractions, is not a data point. It is a detonation. It is the kind of result that, in science and engineering, does not invite further debate. It closes one era and opens another. Jensen Huang has described this moment as the Big Bang. The phrase is precise in the way that all of his characterizations tend to be precise. A Big Bang is not a gradual development. It is a singularity, a moment from which everything that follows is fundamentally different from everything that preceded it. The ImageNet result of 2012 is the moment from which the modern era of artificial intelligence can be dated. Everything before it is one kind of world. Everything after it is another. He recognizes it immediately. Not eventually, not after a period of analysis and consultation and the slow consensus building that governs most large organizational decisions. Immediately. Jensen Huang sees the AlexNet result and understands, with the clarity that comes from having built the infrastructure that made the result possible, exactly what it means. It means that deep neural networks trained on large datasets using the parallel processing power of GPUs can achieve levels of perceptual intelligence that no human-engineered algorithm has ever approached. It means that the methods used to train AlexNet are not specific to image recognition. They are general. The same approach, scaled appropriately, can in principle be applied to any domain where there is sufficient data and sufficient computation. Speech recognition, language understanding, medical diagnosis, autonomous navigation. The complete apparatus of pattern recognition that underlies human intelligence in its most practical forms. And it means that the hardware required to make this possible, the GPU with its thousands of parallel processing cores running CUDA, is not a specialized tool for a specialized problem. It is the engine of a revolution. Huang turns NVIDIA toward deep learning with the decisiveness that has characterized every major pivot in his career. Not cautiously, not incrementally, not with the measured hedging of a leader who wants to preserve optionality while the situation clarifies. He declares, in the language that resonates through an organization when its leader is genuinely certain that NVIDIA is an artificial intelligence company. Let the scale of this decision register. NVIDIA in 2012 is a company of approximately 8,000 employees. It has spent 20 years building expertise in graphics, in the architecture of GPUs optimized for visual rendering, in the driver software that makes those GPUs perform at their best in games and professional applications, in the relationships with game developers and console manufacturers, and the full ecosystem of visual computing. This expertise is real and valuable and hard-won. It is also, in the new world announced by AlexNet, necessary but no longer sufficient. The GPU architectures that render games beautifully are, in their basic structure, well-suited for neural network training. But they are not optimized for it. The specific mathematical operations that dominate neural network computation, matrix multiplications, tensor contractions, the linear algebra that underlies both the forward pass of a neural network and the backward pass of gradient descent, have specific properties that a GPU architecture designed for deep learning can exploit more efficiently than one designed for rendering. Huang redirects the engineering organization toward these optimizations. Every layer of the stack, the silicon architecture, the memory subsystem, the interconnect that allows multiple GPUs to communicate, the compiler and runtime that translate high-level neural network frameworks into hardware instructions, is examined and improved from the perspective of the deep learning workload. The results compound. Each generation of NVIDIA hardware after 2012 is measurably better at neural network training than the previous one, not by the incremental margins of a mature technology, but by factors of 2 and 3 and more, driven by a combination of architectural improvements and manufacturing advances and the software optimizations that the CUDA platform enables. The research community responds with a productivity explosion. Neural network models grow larger and more capable with each passing year. Computer vision improves past human-level accuracy. Speech recognition reaches commercial viability. The first large language models, not yet the enormous systems of later years, but genuine demonstrations of the principle, begin to emerge from research labs at Google, Facebook, and a cluster of university groups. All of them run on NVIDIA hardware. All of them use CUDA. The installed base that Jensen Huang spent 6 years and billions of dollars building is now the foundation on which the entire field of modern artificial intelligence is being constructed. In 2016, he makes a delivery. A small organization in San Francisco called OpenAI has recently been founded, with the stated mission of ensuring that artificial general intelligence, if it arrives, benefits all of humanity. It is a non-profit at this point, idealistic, underfunded relative to its ambitions, staffed by researchers who have chosen mission over the significantly higher salaries available at large technology companies. It is also, in Jensen Huang's assessment, exactly the kind of organization that should be building the future of AI, and exactly the kind of organization that should be building it on NVIDIA hardware. NVIDIA has developed a new product, the DGX-1. It is not a graphics card. It is a complete computing system, a box containing 8 of NVIDIA's most powerful GPUs, connected with high-bandwidth interconnects, running a software stack optimized for deep learning. It is, in the language Jensen Huang will use to describe it, an AI supercomputer in a box. A system that, in a previous era, would have required a dedicated facility and millions of dollars to replicate, now packaged as a single appliance that can be ordered, delivered, and plugged in. Jensen Huang delivers the first DGX-1 personally to OpenAI. He carries it himself. This is not a logistical decision. NVIDIA has people who deliver products. It is a statement. It is the leader of a company handing, with his own hands, the instrument of a potential revolution to the people he believes are best positioned to realize that revolution. The gesture carries, in the economy of symbolic actions, an extraordinary density of meaning. It says, I believe in what you are doing. I want NVIDIA to be the foundation of it. This is not a commercial transaction. It is a covenant. The machine learning research community takes notice. The message is not lost on anyone paying attention. NVIDIA is not a vendor. NVIDIA is a partner. The company's leadership is paying attention to the frontier of the field, understands what the researchers need, and is willing to invest, in products, in relationships, in the long-term cultivation of an ecosystem, in ways that transcend the quarterly cycle. Simultaneously, the architecture of NVIDIA's business is undergoing a transformation as profound as anything in its technical history. For 20 years, NVIDIA's primary customer has been the consumer. The gamer who buys a new graphics card every 2 or 3 years, drawn by the promise of better visuals and higher frame rates in the games they play. This consumer business is real and valuable. It funds the R&D that produces the advances in GPU architecture that benefit everything else. But it is, in the structure of its economics, a retail business. Millions of transactions, each relatively small, driven by consumer sentiment and competitive dynamics and the release schedules of major game titles. The data center business that is emerging after 2012 is structurally different. The customers are hyperscalers, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, the enormous technology companies that are building the cloud computing infrastructure on which the modern digital economy runs. These companies are not buying one GPU at a time. They are buying thousands, tens of thousands, eventually hundreds of thousands of GPUs, to fill the data centers that train the AI models that power their products and their competitive differentiation. A single hyperscaler purchase can exceed the annual revenue of the entire consumer graphics business from a decade earlier. The economics of scale are transformative. The margins are different. The relationship between NVIDIA and its customers is different. Not the anonymous transaction of a consumer product, but the deep, technical partnership of companies whose success is structurally intertwined. Jensen Huang has a phrase for what these data centers are becoming. He calls them AI factories. The metaphor is industrial in the most deliberate sense. A factory is not a place where things are discovered or invented. It is a place where things are produced, reliably, at scale, with consistent quality from inputs to outputs, continuously. An AI factory is a place where intelligence is manufactured, where data goes in and trained models come out, where the raw material of human knowledge, encoded in data sets of extraordinary size and diversity, is processed by GPU clusters of extraordinary computational power into the statistical structures that allow machines to perceive and reason and generate. The factory metaphor implies something important about the nature of the demand. Factories do not pause. They operate continuously, because the cost of idle capacity is the cost of opportunity not taken. The AI factories being built by the hyperscalers in the late 2010s run their GPU clusters at maximum utilization, around the clock, because the models they are training are becoming larger and the competitive advantage of having a more capable model than your competitor is enormous. NVIDIA's revenue from data center customers, nearly negligible before 2012, grows into a significant portion of the company's total revenue by 2016, and continues to grow at rates that exceed any reasonable prior forecast. The analysts who questioned the CUDA investment a decade earlier are now trying to model a business transformation that their existing frameworks are not designed to describe. In 2017, NVIDIA introduces Tensor cores in the Volta architecture. Dedicated hardware units optimized specifically for the matrix multiplication operations that dominate neural network computation. This is not a general-purpose improvement. It is a targeted architectural response to a specific workload, the kind of specialized optimization that is only possible when you understand your customer's computational needs at the deepest level. The performance improvement for neural network training is dramatic, not incremental. The gap between NVIDIA hardware and any alternative widens further. By the end of this period, the shape of the company has changed in ways that would have seemed implausible in 2006. The consumer gaming business, the business that made NVIDIA what it is, that funded the CUDA gamble, that provided the installed base on which the AI revolution was trained, is now one division among several, no longer the primary engine of growth. The data center business is ascending. The research partnerships are deepening. The ecosystem of frameworks and tools built on top of CUDA, TensorFlow, PyTorch, the full software stack of modern deep learning, is so deeply integrated with NVIDIA's hardware that the two are, for practical purposes, inseparable. Jensen Huang is 60 years old. He has been building toward this for 30 years. Not this specifically, not the exact shape of the deep learning revolution, not the precise contours of the transformer architecture or the large language model or the AI factory, but the direction. The conviction that parallel computing was the future of the most important computational problems in science and technology. The patience to build the infrastructure before the application arrived. The willingness to be wrong in public for as long as it took to be right. The application has arrived. And NVIDIA is not merely positioned to benefit from it. NVIDIA is the reason it was possible. Chapter 9. The Trillion-Dollar Pivot, 2019 to 2024. There is a moment in the life of every long arc when the distance traveled becomes visible. Not the destination. The destination is always further than it appears, always receding as you approach it, always revealing new complexity from close range that was invisible from far away. But the distance traveled. The accumulated consequence of decisions made years and decades earlier, now manifesting in the present as outcomes that seem, to those who were not watching the whole arc, sudden and inexplicable. Overnight successes that were 30 years in the making. Revolutions that were prepared for so long that the preparation itself became invisible. Jensen Huang, in the years between 2019 and 2024, watches the distance he has traveled become visible to the world. He does not watch it quietly. The year 2020 arrives with a particular quality of years that will later be described as turning points. Dense with consequence, difficult to navigate in real time, clarifying only in retrospect. For Jensen Huang, it brings an ambition of a scale that even his career, with its history of large bets and longer visions, has not previously attempted. He wants to buy ARM. ARM Limited is not a company that most consumers have heard of, despite the fact that its technology is present in virtually every smartphone on the planet, in billions of embedded devices, in the processors that power an ever-expanding share of the world's computing infrastructure. ARM does not make chips. It designs the instruction set architectures and processor cores that other companies license to build their own chips. It is the foundation on which the modern mobile computing revolution was built. The architectural DNA embedded in the processors designed by Apple, Qualcomm, Samsung, and dozens of other semiconductor companies that collectively define how the world computes away from the desktop. The combination that Jensen Huang envisions is not subtle in its ambition. NVIDIA brings the GPU, the parallel computing engine that has become the essential hardware of artificial intelligence. ARM brings the CPU architecture that governs the broadest swath of computing in the world. Together, they would represent something close to a complete computing stack. The ability to address virtually every category of computational workload, from the edge devices that sense and actuate in the physical world to the data center clusters that train the models that give those devices their intelligence. He describes the goal with characteristic precision: the world's premier computing company for the age of AI. The deal is announced in September 2020. $40 billion. The largest acquisition in semiconductor history. The regulatory response is immediate and comprehensive. The Federal Trade Commission, under the leadership of Lina Khan, a legal scholar whose academic work on platform competition and the antitrust implications of vertical integration has made her one of the most consequential regulatory voices of her generation, announces its opposition. The concern is not complex to articulate. If NVIDIA controls ARM, NVIDIA controls the architectural foundation on which its competitors build their chips. The neutrality that has made ARM's licensing model universally acceptable. The reason that Apple and Qualcomm and Samsung and MediaTek can all license the same instruction set architecture without competitive concern, depends entirely on the independence of the licensor. An ARM owned by NVIDIA is not a neutral arm. It is a potential weapon. The United Kingdom launches its own investigation, invoking national security considerations alongside competition concerns. The European Union opens proceedings. China, whose semiconductor industry is deeply dependent on ARM architectures and which has its own complex reasons to be concerned about American control of critical technology infrastructure, signals opposition. Jensen Huang does not abandon the attempt immediately. He argues, with the systematic clarity that characterizes his public communications, that the combination would accelerate innovation rather than stifling it, that NVIDIA's resources and technical expertise would make ARM's roadmap more ambitious, not less accessible. He offers commitments to maintain ARM's neutral licensing model, to keep its headquarters in the United Kingdom, to continue supplying all existing and future licensees without discrimination. The regulators are not persuaded. On February 7, 2022, the deal collapses. 18 months of regulatory combat, concluding in the abandonment of the largest acquisition in semiconductor history. For most companies and most CEOs, this would be a defining setback. The kind of failure that shadows a career, that becomes the answer to the question of what the leader tried and could not accomplish. Jensen Huang issues a statement that is, in its composure, almost startling. He notes that while the two companies will not become one, they will continue to work closely together. NVIDIA will remain an ARM licensee. The partnership will continue. He has lost the acquisition and retained the relationship, and he speaks about this outcome not as a defeat softened by consolation but as a practical recalibration. The clear-eyed assessment of a man who has navigated enough genuine crises to know the difference between a setback and a catastrophe. He moves forward. And 9 months later, in November of 2022, the world changes. ChatGPT is released by OpenAI, that same organization to which Jensen Huang personally delivered the first DGX, 6 years earlier, carrying it with his own hands as a gesture of partnership and belief. ChatGPT is not technically a new kind of system. The transformer architecture on which it is built has been published in academic literature since 2017. Large language models have been the subject of research papers and internal projects at major technology companies for several years. The capability, in some sense, has been visible to those paying close attention. But ChatGPT makes the capability visible to everyone. Within days of its release, it is the fastest-growing consumer application in history. Within weeks, it is a cultural phenomenon, discussed in living rooms and boardrooms and legislative chambers and newspaper opinion sections, generating a quality of public attention that technology products rarely achieve and almost never sustain. People who have never thought about artificial intelligence, who have never read a paper on deep learning or considered the implications of large-scale neural networks, are suddenly using one. And finding, in the experience of using one, something they did not expect. It works. Not perfectly. Not without errors and hallucinations and the other well-documented limitations of systems that generate language statistically rather than reasoning from first principles. But well enough to be genuinely, immediately, practically useful in ways that the previous generation of AI assistants, the voice interfaces and chatbots that preceded it, never approached. Well enough to produce, in the people who encounter it for the first time, the specific quality of wonder that accompanies the recognition that something has changed. The gold rush begins. Every major technology company on Earth, and a generation of startups funded by a venture capital community suddenly electrified by the demonstrated commercial potential of generative AI, begins building. Building AI products, AI services, AI infrastructure. Building the data centers that will train the next generation of models, larger and more capable than the ones that produced ChatGPT, each one requiring more computational power than the last. Building the pipelines and the tools and the platforms and the applications that will translate the raw capability of large language models into the products that businesses and consumers will eventually use. All of this building requires hardware. Specifically, it requires the H100, NVIDIA's most powerful data center GPU, built on the Hopper architecture, optimized with hardware-level support for the transformer operations that underlie the large language models driving the AI explosion. The H100 costs approximately $40,000 per unit. A single training cluster for a frontier AI model requires thousands of them. The major technology companies are ordering them in quantities that strain NVIDIA's supply chain, quantities measured not in units but in clusters, in racks, in the megawatt-scale power budgets of the data centers being built to house them. Demand exceeds supply. Not marginally, dramatically. The waiting lists for H100 units extend months into the future. Companies that can acquire them early gain a meaningful competitive advantage. The ability to train larger models faster than competitors is, in the AI gold rush of 2023, a strategic asset of the first order. The H100 becomes, in the vocabulary of technology industry observers, the new oil, a scarce resource whose control confers disproportionate power. NVIDIA stock price enters a trajectory that financial analysts struggle to describe with existing vocabulary. In early 2023, NVIDIA's market capitalization is approximately $300 billion. Large, certainly by any historical standard, but comprehensible within the normal range of major technology companies. By the end of 2023, it has exceeded $1 trillion. By the spring of 2024, it has passed $2 trillion, and then $3 trillion, briefly making NVIDIA the most valuable company in the world, surpassing Apple, surpassing Microsoft, surpassing every company that has ever existed in the long history of the semiconductor industry. The number is so large that it strains ordinary financial intuition. $3 trillion. More than the entire GDP of the United Kingdom. More than the combined value of most of the world's national stock markets. A number generated not by a consumer products company with billions of individual customers, not by a platform with network effects compounding over decades, but by a company that makes chips, extraordinarily important chips, chips without which the AI revolution cannot proceed, but chips nonetheless, manufactured objects, silicon and copper, and the accumulated engineering intelligence of 30 years. Jensen Huang, whose parents sent him to English lessons at a kitchen table in Southeast Asia so that he would be ready for America, whose uncle sent him to a reform school in Kentucky because he misread the brochure, who sat in a Denny's booth with $40,000 and a thesis about parallel computing, who watched his first chip rendered obsolete by a Microsoft announcement and flew to Japan to tell his most important customer the truth about his own failure. Jensen Huang is, by any measure, one of the wealthiest and most consequential figures in the history of technology. He is not particularly interested in this characterization. What interests him is the next problem. The next architecture. The next phase of the transition that he has been describing, with varying degrees of specificity for 30 years, the transition from a world in which computing is something computers do to a world in which intelligence is something computers provide. He calls it agentic AI. The concept is not complex to describe but is profound in its implications. The first generation of large AI models, the ones that produce ChatGPT and its successors, are essentially responsive systems. They answer questions. They generate content. They respond to prompts with outputs that are impressive and useful but fundamentally reactive. A user provides input, the model provides output. The interaction ends there. Agentic AI is different. An agentic system does not merely respond, it acts. It perceives its environment, forms goals, plans sequences of actions to achieve those goals, executes those actions, evaluates the results, and adjusts its approach accordingly. It operates, in other words, with a degree of autonomy that the responsive model does not. It is not waiting to be asked. It is working. The computational implications of agentic AI are enormous. A responsive model processes a query and returns a result. A single forward pass through a neural network, computationally intensive but bounded. An agentic system runs continuously, executing multiple inference passes in sequence, calling tools, processing results, updating its state, planning its next action. The compute requirements scale not linearly but multiplicatively. Each additional degree of autonomy requires additional inference, and the demand for inference hardware grows accordingly. NVIDIA is building for this future with the same systematic foresight that characterized the CUDA investment. The Hopper architecture, with its transformer engine, dedicated hardware for the attention operations at the heart of transformer-based models, is not merely an incremental improvement over its predecessors. It is a statement of architectural intention. NVIDIA's hardware will be designed at the level of the silicon, for the specific mathematical operations that define the frontier of AI research. The relationship between hardware and software, Jensen Huang argues in this period with increasing urgency, has fundamentally changed. In the previous era, performance scaled with transistors. Moore's law delivered regular improvements in computing capability that software developers could rely on without changing their code. In the new era, performance scales with models. Better software, more capable AI models, trained on more data with more sophisticated architectures. running on specialized hardware delivers improvements that no transistor scaling can match. This is a profound reorientation. It means that the competitive advantage in computing is shifting from the ability to manufacture smaller transistors to the ability to build better models. It means that the hardware company and the AI research community are not separate ecosystems but deeply, structurally interdependent, each advancing in response to the other, each requiring the other to reach its potential. It means that NVIDIA, which has spent 30 years building the hardware of artificial intelligence, is now also building something harder to define but equally important: the architectural vision of what artificial intelligence is for. The arc is long. It began in Taiwan in 1963, in a household defined by the complementary disciplines of engineering and education. It passed through a reform school in Kentucky and a table tennis table in Oregon and a Denny's booth in San Jose and a data center in Tokyo and a laboratory at the University of Toronto. It has arrived in 2024 at a market capitalization of $3 trillion and a cultural position at the absolute center of the most consequential technological transformation in human history. But the arc is not complete. Jensen Huang, in his 60s, shows no signs of the deceleration that usually accompanies the achievement of everything a person set out to achieve. He shows, instead, the particular quality of energy that belongs to people who have always understood that the achievement is not the point. The work is the point. The next problem. The next architecture. The next generation of hardware for the next generation of intelligence. The world is watching NVIDIA now in a way it has never watched a semiconductor company before. The analysts and the journalists and the policymakers and the competitors are all paying attention, all trying to understand how a company got to this position and whether it can stay here and what the implications are for everyone else. Jensen Huang is not watching the watchers. He is already thinking about what comes next. He always has been. Chapter 10. The Sovereign AI Future, 2024 to 2026. There is a particular quality of attention that the world reserves for people who have been proven right about something large. Not merely successful. The world is full of successful people, and success attracts its own varieties of attention, calibrated to the scale of the achievement and the visibility of its expression. The attention reserved for people who have been proven right about something large is different in kind. It carries, beneath its surface enthusiasm, a quality of retrospective recalibration. The world adjusting its model of the person to accommodate the evidence that their vision, which once seemed eccentric or premature or simply too large to take seriously, has turned out to be accurate. Sometimes literally decades ahead of schedule. By 2024, the world is recalibrating its model of Jensen Huang. The recalibration is visible in the specific quality of attention that accompanies his public appearances. When he walks onto a stage, the vast arenas that NVIDIA's GPU Technology Conference now fills, the keynote halls of the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, the government meeting rooms of national capitals that have come to treat his visits with a gravity they once reserved for heads of state, the audience is not merely curious. It is attentive in the way that people are attentive when they believe the person speaking knows something important about the future and is willing to describe it. He is describing it. He has been describing it for 30 years. The audience is simply larger now and more persuaded and considerably more willing to listen. The concept he is carrying into the national capitals of the world in 2024 and 2025 is called sovereign AI. It is, at its core, a geopolitical argument dressed in technical clothing, or perhaps a technical argument with geopolitical implications so profound that the distinction between the two has become meaningless. The argument begins with a recognition that most national governments are only beginning to fully process. Artificial intelligence is not, in its mature form, a software product that you purchase from a technology company and deploy on your existing infrastructure. It is an infrastructure itself. The models that power the most capable AI systems, the large language models, the multimodal systems, the agentic frameworks that are beginning to manage complex tasks with minimal human intervention, are not applications that run on neutral hardware. They are statistical structures trained on specific data, reflecting the assumptions and priorities and cultural contexts of the people and organizations that built them. A country that relies entirely on AI systems built and hosted by foreign entities is not merely technologically dependent. It is, in a meaningful sense, epistemically dependent. Its government decisions, its economic analyses, its educational content, its medical diagnostics, its legal interpretations. If all of these are mediated by AI systems whose training data, whose architectural choices, whose operational infrastructure exists outside the country's jurisdiction and control, then the country has ceded a form of sovereignty that no previous technology made possible to cede in quite this way. Jensen Huang makes this argument in London and in Tokyo and in New Delhi and in capitals across Europe and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. He makes it with the fluency of someone who has been thinking about the relationship between computing infrastructure and national capability for a very long time, and with the strategic precision of someone who understands that the argument, if accepted, has a specific commercial implication. Every nation that decides it needs sovereign AI infrastructure needs the hardware to build it. NVIDIA makes the hardware. In the United Kingdom, whose technology sector has genuine depth and genuine ambition but whose physical AI infrastructure, the data centers, the GPU clusters, the computational substrate on which sovereign AI models would be trained, lags behind the scale of its aspirations, Huang delivers both a compliment and a challenge. He describes the British technology ecosystem as the envy of the world, and means it. The research universities, the concentration of AI talent, the policy sophistication of a government that has decided to take AI seriously. And then he identifies the gap: infrastructure. The physical reality of compute. The racks of GPUs in the data centers that do not yet exist at the scale the ambition requires. The message is diplomatic but clear. The vision is admirable. The foundation is insufficient. And the path from insufficient to sufficient runs through NVIDIA's product catalog. This is not cynicism. Jensen Huang genuinely believes what he is saying about sovereign AI. The argument is coherent and the concern is legitimate, and the governments receiving it are not wrong to take it seriously. But the coincidence of the argument's logic with NVIDIA's commercial interests is not invisible to anyone in the room, and Jensen Huang does not pretend that it is. He has never been a man who benefits from pretending that things are other than they are. He is a man who makes clear-eyed assessments of reality and acts on them, and in 2025, the clear-eyed assessment is that the world's nations are going to build AI infrastructure, and that NVIDIA is going to supply it, and that the question is not whether this will happen but how quickly and at what scale. The hardware at the center of this global build-out is the Blackwell architecture, unveiled in March of 2024 with the theatrical precision that Jensen Huang's product launches have cultivated over decades. Blackwell is not an incremental improvement. The numbers that describe it exist at a scale that strains the ordinary vocabulary of semiconductor announcement. 208 billion transistors in a single package. A custom fabrication process at TSMC, the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company, that pushes the boundaries of what is manufacturable at any price. Performance characteristics for AI inference and training that exceed its predecessor, the Hopper architecture's H100, by margins that the previous pace of GPU development would have required multiple generations to achieve. The mention of TSMC opens a subject that Jensen Huang addresses with a directness that is characteristic and, in this geopolitical moment, significant. TSMC is the foundry on which NVIDIA's most advanced chips are manufactured. It is, in the structure of the global semiconductor supply chain, the single most important and least substitutable link. The organization whose process technology is so far ahead of every alternative that the world's most demanding semiconductor designs have essentially no other option. Intel's foundry business is growing but not yet competitive at the frontier. Samsung's advanced nodes exist but trail TSMC's in yield and reliability for the most complex designs. For chips like Blackwell, there is TSMC and there is everything else, and everything else is not actually an option. Jensen Huang captures this reality in a line that will be quoted extensively. Basically, there is air and TSMC. The line is funny, in the way that Jensen Huang's best lines are funny, not a joke but a compression of something true into a form compact enough to be memorable. It acknowledges, with the honesty that has defined his public communication since the flight to Japan in 1995, a dependency that some executives in his position might prefer to minimize. NVIDIA cannot make its own chips. NVIDIA requires TSMC to make its chips. TSMC is located in Taiwan. Taiwan exists in a geopolitical situation of extraordinary delicacy. These facts are connected, and the connection has implications that everyone in the semiconductor industry thinks about and not everyone discusses plainly. Jensen Huang discusses it plainly. Not because he has a solution. The concentration of advanced semiconductor manufacturing in Taiwan is not a problem that any single company can resolve, but because acknowledging a risk clearly is the precondition for managing it, and because the pretense that the risk does not exist serves no one except those who prefer comfortable fictions to actionable truths. NVIDIA's revenue in fiscal year 2025 reaches $130.5 billion. The number is almost incomprehensible against the baseline of the company's history, against the $40,000 in the Denny's booth, against the 30 days of runway in 1995, against the billions spent on CUDA with no immediate return, against the reasonable forecasts of any analyst in any year before 2022 who was asked to project where NVIDIA's revenue might be in 3 years. The number is the accumulated consequence of every right decision and every survived wrong one, of the patience and the urgency and the radical honesty and the willingness to hold a conviction through the years when the conviction was not yet vindicated. The market capitalization climbs and fluctuates above $3.4 trillion, a number that places NVIDIA among the handful of most valuable entities in human commercial history, in company with organizations that have existed for decades or centuries longer. And then there is the jacket. It is a Tom Ford patent-printed leather jacket, and Jensen Huang wears it to the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas in January of 2025 with the particular ease of someone who has stopped apologizing for what he is. The jacket costs nearly $9,000. It sells out within days of being identified and publicized. A product that has never been in particular demand becoming instantly unavailable because the man who wears it has become, in the specific economy of cultural attention, a figure of sufficient symbolic weight that his choices carry commercial consequence. This is a strange kind of power, and Jensen Huang wears it, the jacket and the power, with a grounded quality that is worth examining. He credits his wife and daughter for his signature look. This is not false modesty or performative humility. It is the acknowledgement of a genuine truth about the architecture of his life. That Laurie, who said yes to his homework offer in a Corvallis engineering class more than 40 years ago, has been present for every chapter of what he has built, and that the man who stands on stages in leather jackets accepting the world's attention is not separable from the husband and father who comes home. He credits his parents. The mother with the dictionary and the 10 words a day. The father with the engineer's habit of looking at problems until they yield. He speaks about them, when he speaks about them at all, with a reverence that has not diminished with success. The reverence of someone who understands exactly where the foundation was laid and by whom and at what cost. And he maintains, in 2025 and 2026, in a company worth more than $3 trillion, with revenues of $130 billion, with government leaders treating his visits as matters of national importance. He maintains the 30-day mentality. Not as a rhetorical device. Not as a piece of corporate mythology deployed in all-hands meetings to motivate engineers who do not actually believe the company is 30 days from collapse. As a genuine orientation. A practiced refusal to allow the distance traveled to produce the complacency that distance traveled usually produces. A daily recommitment to the awareness that the gap between a thriving company and a failed one is shorter than it looks from inside a thriving company, and that the only reliable protection against catastrophe is to behave as though catastrophe is possible. Always possible. Always 30 days away. The world that Jensen Huang is describing in 2025 and 2026. The world of sovereign AI and agentic systems and national AI factories and the deep structural integration of artificial intelligence into the machinery of economic and governmental function, is not a distant future. It is the present, arriving faster than most of its participants are prepared for, generating questions at a rate that exceeds the capacity of existing institutions to answer them. What happens to labor markets when agentic AI systems can perform complex cognitive tasks autonomously? What happens to national sovereignty when intelligence itself becomes a manufactured commodity, produced in AI factories and distributed through cloud infrastructure by a small number of very large and very powerful technology companies. What happens to human creativity and human meaning when the tools for generating text and images and music and code become universally available and almost effortlessly capable? Jensen Huang does not claim to have answered these questions. He raises them in the conversations he is having in the national capitals and the conference halls and the research institutions of 2025, with the genuine curiosity of someone who is deeply implicated in the forces generating them and is under no illusion that implication equals understanding. He is building the infrastructure of a future he cannot fully describe. He believes it will be better than the past, that the application of intelligence, artificial and human, to the problems of disease and poverty and climate and the full range of human suffering is a net good, that the discomfort of transition is real but the destination is worth it. This is a faith, not a proof. Jensen Huang knows the difference. He is standing in early 2026, at the apex of a career that began in the warmth of Taiwan and passed through the cold discipline of Oneida and the patient accumulation of Oregon State and Stanford and AMD and LSI Logic and the Denny's Covenant and the near-death experience and the CUDA gamble and the deep learning discovery and the trillion-dollar pivot. Every chapter of that career has been preparation for the next one. Every crisis has been the price of the clarity that followed it. Every 30 days has led to the 30 days after it. He is 62 years old. He shows no signs of stopping. The boy who learned 10 English words a day at a kitchen table in Southeast Asia, who cleaned toilets and survived threats and held himself together without a map or a guide, who sat in a booth and ordered coffee and decided to bet everything on the idea that the future of computing was parallel. That boy is still in the room. Still driving. Still refusing to accept the comfortable version of the story. Still behaving every morning as though the work that matters is the work that has not yet been done. The parallel architect. Still building. The story of NVIDIA is more than a chronicle of chips and software. It is a testament to the power of speed of light thinking and the courage to pivot when the world demands a new architecture. As we move into the era of sovereign AI, the machines built by Jensen Huang continue to redefine the boundaries of human capability. The silicon engine is humming, and the future is being written in real time. This has been a Bedtime Biographies production. Thank you for listening.